somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before telescopes, before satellites, before we understood what stars actually were, people lay on rooftops and stared upward, tracking points of light that moved against the fixed background of the sky. They gave those wandering lights names. They gave them meanings. And somewhere in that tradition of watching, one name emerges that still sparks arguments today. Nibiru. If you've spent any time online, you've probably heard the modern version of this story. A hidden planet, sometimes called Planet X, supposedly on a massive elliptical orbit that brings it screaming through the inner solar system every few thousand years, close enough to disrupt Earth, close enough to trigger floods, pole shifts, civilization collapse. The claim is that ancient people knew about this, that they watched it happen before, that they left warnings, and that we're overdue. It's a compelling story. It's also, as we'll see, a story that gets tangled up with real history in ways that are easy to misunderstand. Because here's what nobody tells you when this theory gets thrown around on late-night documentaries and internet forums. Nibiru is a real word. It appears in real ancient texts. Mesopotamian scribes really did write about it thousands of years ago on clay tablets that archaeologists have actually dug up and translated. That part isn't fabricated. What's far more complicated is what those scribes actually meant by it, and whether it has anything at all to do with hidden planets or global resets. This is the investigation we're starting tonight. Not a debunking, not a defense, but a careful walk through what the ancient world actually recorded about the sky, and how a term used by Babylonian astronomers ended up thousands of years later at the center of doomsday predictions circulating on the internet. We're going to look at cuneiform tablets and star catalogues. We're going to look at flood myths from cultures that never had contact with each other. We're going to look at how a modern writer named Zecharia Sitchin took ancient words and built an entirely new mythology around them in the 20th century. And we're going to ask honestly what astronomers today can and cannot rule out when it comes to hidden objects in our solar system. Along the way we'll wander through Babylon and Egypt, through Mayan calendars and Norse prophecy, through Hindu cosmic ages that stretch across billions of years. Because it turns out almost every ancient civilization had some version of this idea. That time moves in cycles, that worlds end and worlds begin again, that the sky itself might be trying to tell us something about when the next ending is due. Whether any of that connects to an actual undiscovered planet is a question we'll take seriously, carefully, without rushing to easy answers in either direction. Before we drift further into Babylon and its stargazers, if you're listening to this to help you fall asleep, that's exactly why I put these together. So tell me where you're tucking in tonight and what time it is where you are. I've seen comments rolling in from Tokyo at sunrise, from Chicago right before midnight, from someone in Lisbon who says this is the only thing that quiets their mind enough to drift off. It's strange and wonderful realizing how many time zones are listening to the same slow unraveling of history at once. And if you find yourself coming back to these episodes night after night, the best way to support what I'm doing here costs nothing. Follow the show on Spotify, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. There's a link down in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's go back to where the word Nibiru actually comes from, long before it meant anything close to what people claim about it today. So let's start with the word itself, stripped of everything the internet has piled on top of it. Nibiru comes from Akkadian, the language spoken across Babylon and Assyria for thousands of years, written in wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay that somehow survived long enough for modern scholars to dig up and decode. And when Assyriologists sat down with these tablets and tried to translate the word Nibiru, what they found wasn't a name for a planet, wasn't a name for a rogue world hurtling through the solar system. What they found was a word that most closely translates to something like crossing or crossing place or point of transition. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Not a destination, not an object, a crossing, a place where something moves from one state into another. It's the kind of word you might use to describe a ford across a river, a threshold between two territories, or in the context of the sky, a point where a celestial body appears to cross from one region of the heavens into another. That's a very different concept than a hidden ninth planet on a 6,000-year elliptical orbit. It's closer to a marker, a coordinate, a moment of transition observed and recorded by people who spent their nights watching the sky with obsessive precision. But here's where things get genuinely complicated, and where careful listeners should lean in a little closer. The meaning of Nibiru wasn't fixed. It wasn't a single, stable label that always pointed to the same object in the sky. Depending on which text you're reading, which time period it comes from, and which scribe was doing the writing, Nibiru could refer to different things. In some contexts, ancient astronomers associated the term with the planet Jupiter, specifically Jupiter at a particular point in its movement across the sky, likely near its heliacal rising, the moment when a celestial body becomes visible again after a period of being hidden by the sun's glare. In other contexts, Nibiru appears connected to Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, whose identity was intertwined with planetary observation in ways that blurred the line between religious symbolism and astronomical record-keeping. This is something that trips up a lot of modern readers who come to these texts expecting the same kind of precision we'd expect from a modern star catalogue. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomy wasn't separated from religion and mythology the way we tend to separate them today. The movements of planets were understood as the movements of gods. A crossing point in the sky could simultaneously be an astronomical observation and a theological statement about where a particular deity stood in relation to the heavens at a particular moment in the ritual calendar. So when a scribe wrote about Nibiru, they might have been doing several things at once, tracking an actual celestial position, invoking the presence of a god, and marking a point of significance in a religious or agricultural calendar that had nothing to do with predicting catastrophe thousands of years in the future. This is the first and maybe the most important thing to understand before we go any further into this investigation. Nibiru, as it exists in the historical record, is a technical term embedded in a specific tradition of sky watching, wrapped in religious meaning, and used inconsistently across centuries of texts written by different scribes with different purposes. It is not, in its original context, the name of a planet waiting undiscovered at the edges of our solar system. That image, the wandering world on a doomsday orbit, is a modern invention built centuries later by someone reading these ancient texts through an entirely different lens. We'll get to that story soon enough, but we can't understand what came later without first being honest about what came first. And honesty here requires admitting something uncomfortable for anyone hoping for a clean, simple answer. Translating ancient technical language is hard. Genuinely, seriously hard. Akkadian went out of everyday use over 2,000 years ago. The scribes who wrote these astronomical texts were using specialized vocabulary, terms specific to a discipline that doesn't map cleanly onto modern astronomy or modern language. When a translator sits down with a cuneiform tablet describing the movement of Nibiru, they're not just converting words from one language to another. They're trying to reconstruct an entire conceptual framework, one where planets are gods, where crossing points carry ritual significance, where the same term might shift meaning depending on whether it's describing Jupiter, Marduk, or possibly something else entirely that we no longer have the context to identify with confidence. This is exactly the kind of ambiguity that leaves room for wildly different interpretations to take root. If a term can plausibly mean several different things depending on context, and if that context is itself thousands of years removed and only partially reconstructible, then that term becomes fertile ground for anyone wanting to project a particular theory onto the ancient world. It doesn't mean every interpretation is equally valid. Scholarly translation, grounded in comparative analysis of dozens or hundreds of similar texts, is not the same as speculative reinterpretation built to support a predetermined conclusion. But it does mean that when someone tells you Nibiru definitely referred to a hidden planet on a catastrophic collision course with Earth, you're entitled to ask, based on which text, translated by whom, and using what evidence. So here's the question this section leaves us with. The question will carry forward as we move deeper into Mesopotamian astronomy. Can a word that meant crossing, a technical term for a celestial transition point observed by ancient skywatchers, really support the modern claim of a returning rogue planet, triggering global resets on a fixed timetable? Or is that claim built on something else entirely, a chain of translation, reinterpretation, and modern imagination stretched across a gap of literally thousands of years? We're not answering that yet. We're just sitting with the question, letting it settle, the way you might lie back and stare up at a dark sky, watching a point of light and wondering, genuinely wondering, what the people who first named it were actually trying to say. To answer that properly, we need to go back to where this tradition of naming and tracking the sky actually began, in the flat river valleys of Mesopotamia, where systematic sky watching first became something close to a science. Mesopotamia was not one kingdom, one people, or one moment in time. It was a long inhabited landscape between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place of cities rising, falling, and rising again over thousands of years. Sumerian city-states came first, then Akkadian kings, then Assyrian empires in the north and Babylonian dynasties in the south. Languages changed, gods changed, capitals moved, but above every palace, temple, field, canal, and mud brick house, the same sky kept moving. And people noticed. They noticed the moon first, probably because everybody notices the moon. It grows thin, disappears, returns as a silver curve, swells toward fullness, and then begins the slow fading process all over again. In a land where planting, irrigation, harvest, travel, religious festivals, and tax collection all depended on knowing the time of year, that repeating pattern mattered. A missed seasonal shift could mean grain planted too early, canals cleared too late, or food stores running low before the next harvest. So the sky was never just decoration, it was a schedule. But over centuries, and then millennia, Mesopotamian observers went far beyond simply noticing that the moon changed shape. They began to follow the paths of the wandering lights, the bodies we now call planets. Mercury appearing briefly near the horizon, difficult to catch before it vanished into the sun's glare. Venus blazing in the evening, then disappearing, then returning in the morning. Mars with its reddish colour. Jupiter moving steadily through the stars. Saturn, dimmer and slower, taking years to make its way around the sky. The fixed stars were important too. They marked seasons and directions. Their first appearances before dawn, what astronomers call heliacal risings, could serve as useful signals in the agricultural year. Constellations became part of a vast celestial landscape, divided, named, and organized in ways that connected the heavens to the land below. And then there were eclipses. An eclipse is one of those events that can make even a modern person stop what they're doing. The familiar moon suddenly darkening, the sun under rare conditions transformed into something strange and incomplete in the middle of daylight. Imagine experiencing that without electric lights, without weather satellites, without a scientific explanation available in a book or on a screen. The sky itself seems to break its usual rules. Of course people paid attention. Of course they recorded it. An eclipse was not merely interesting. It was potentially urgent by the time of the Assyrian and Babylonian kingdoms, especially during the first millennium BCE. Recording the sky had become the work of trained specialists. These were scribes, scholars attached to temples and royal courts, men educated in cuneiform writing, and in large bodies of inherited knowledge. Night after night, whenever conditions allowed, they watched. They noted the date. They noted the position of the moon. They noted when Venus first became visible, when Jupiter stood near a particular star, when Mars appeared unusually bright, when clouds hid an expected sighting, when an eclipse began, and where its shadow seemed to fall. Then they pressed those observations into wet clay. That detail matters. Clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia. It was used for bricks, jars, seals, and tablets. A scribe could take a small damp tablet, impress wedge-shaped signs with a reed stylus, and leave behind a record that would harden in the dry heat. Some tablets were baked intentionally, others were fired accidentally when palaces and libraries burned. Either way, thousands of years later, those hard little blocks of clay still carried the night notes of ancient observers. This is why Mesopotamian astronomy is so extraordinary. Not because the people of Babylon possessed secret knowledge of a hidden planet. Not because they had decoded every catastrophe waiting in humanity's future. It is extraordinary because they made observation cumulative. One generation did not have to begin from nothing. A young scholar could learn from records kept by older scholars. A court could compare this year's lunar eclipse with one recorded decades earlier. Patterns that no single human lifetime could easily see began to emerge from archives. Think about the patience involved. A planet moves strangely, at least from Earth. It can appear to slow down, reverse direction against the background stars, then resume its normal path. This is what we call retrograde motion. To understand that it was a pattern rather than a cosmic malfunction, you had to watch carefully over long periods. You had to preserve records. You had to trust that the sky, even when confusing, was not random. That trust was one of the great foundations of Mesopotamian intellectual life. The universe was meaningful. Events had patterns. The gods were not necessarily easy to understand, and they were certainly not always kind, but their world was ordered enough that careful attention might reveal something about what was coming. That something could be practical. The lunar month helped organize the calendar. Seasonal star patterns could support agricultural timing. Priests and administrators needed to know when festivals should be held. Kings needed a shared schedule for offerings, labour, military movements, and taxation. In a river valley where flooding, drought, and harvest could determine whether a city ate or starved, keeping time was not an abstract hobby. It was survival with a calendar attached. But it was also political. Mesopotamian kings did not rule in a modern secular state, separated neatly from religion and cosmic meaning. A king was expected to maintain order on earth in relationship with the gods above. If the heavens displayed an unusual sign, that sign might concern the king, the kingdom, war, famine, rebellion, disease, or the fate of a rival city. A strange lunar halo, an eclipse, a planet's unexpected appearance. All of these could be read as messages requiring interpretation. And this is where we need to slow down, because it is easy to use the word prediction in a way that blurs two very different things. Modern scientific prediction works by building models of physical processes. If you know enough about gravity, motion, and the positions of the Earth, Moon, and Sun, you can calculate an eclipse before it happens. You can say where it will be visible and, within very narrow limits, when it will begin. The eclipse does not happen because it means something. It happens because bodies moving through space follow physical laws. Mesopotamian scholars were moving toward part of that kind of predictive skill, especially in later Babylonian astronomy. Through generations of observations, they recognized repeating lunar and planetary patterns. They became remarkably good at anticipating certain celestial events. Not perfect, not in the modern sense, and not through an understanding of gravity or heliocentric orbits. but good enough that Babylonian astronomers eventually developed sophisticated numerical methods for calculating lunar phenomena and planetary positions. That is a real achievement. It deserves to be admired without turning it into something it was not. At the same time, many of these observations were gathered for divination. The question was often not simply, will there be an eclipse? It was, what does this eclipse mean for the king? If Mars appears in this part of the sky, does that suggest conflict? If the moon is eclipsed in a particular month, is danger coming from a particular direction? The celestial event could be expected, or at least recognized as part of a recurring pattern, while its supposed consequence remained an omen, a message to be interpreted. Those are not the same claim. One is observational. Venus disappeared for a certain number of days and then returned. One is predictive in a practical, limited sense. Based on previous cycles, Venus may return around this time. And one is divinatory. Venus returning in this way may signal something about the fate of the kingdom. The first two can be checked against the sky. The third belongs to a religious and political system of meaning. It may have guided real decisions, sometimes enormous decisions, but it is not a scientific forecast in the modern sense. This distinction becomes important when people look at Mesopotamian astronomy and see precision, calendars, eclipse records, and long cycles, then leap immediately to the idea that the Babylonians must have known about a repeating global reset. They did observe cycles, very carefully. They understood that many celestial events returned according to rhythms that could be tracked across years and decades. But a cycle in the sky is not automatically a cycle of worldwide destruction. Jupiter returns, the moon renews itself, Venus disappears and reappears. Eclipses recur in patterns. None of that, by itself, says that Earth is destined to be struck by catastrophe on a fixed cosmic timetable. In fact, the deeper lesson of Mesopotamian sky watching may be almost the opposite. These scholars lived in a world that could be violently uncertain. Rivers flooded, crops failed, armies arrived, kings died. Disease moved through crowded cities. And faced with all that uncertainty, they watched the heavens because the heavens seemed regular. The sky offered a framework, a possibility that beneath the confusion of daily life there might be order. Not necessarily comfort. An eclipse could still be terrifying. An omen could still warn of disaster. But order, sequence, record, pattern, and somewhere in those patterns among the moving lights and the carefully dated tablets, the term Nibiru took on its ancient significance. Not as a world breaker racing invisibly toward Earth, but as part of a much larger Mesopotamian attempt to map crossings, movements, divine signs, and the structure of the heavens themselves. To understand that word properly, we need to enter one of Mesopotamia's great creation stories, where Marduk establishes order in the cosmos and gives Nibiru a place within it. The story begins in darkness, before the sky had its familiar shape, before the moon had a monthly path, before the stars had been assigned their places. At least, that is how the Babylonian creation epic tells it. The poem is called the Enuma Elish, named after its opening words, usually translated as "when on high." It was written in Akkadian, preserved on clay tablets, and copied many times in ancient Mesopotamia. The version we know best probably took its familiar form in Babylon during the 2nd millennium BCE, though it drew on much older traditions. It is not an astronomy textbook. It is not a record of a witnessed cosmic impact. It is a religious epic about divine power, kingship, creation, and the transformation of chaos into order. But it is filled with astronomical language that matters because the Babylonians did not sharply divide mythology, religion, politics, and sky, watching the way a modern person might. The heavens were not empty space populated by neutral objects. They were a living divine realm. The sun, moon, planets and stars moved through a universe governed by gods, marked by boundaries, crossings, stations and responsibilities. And at the centre of the Enuma Elish stands Marduk. Marduk was the patron god of Babylon. As Babylon became powerful, Marduk became powerful too, not in a literal political sense, but in the stories people told about the structure of reality. In the epic, the younger gods disturb the ancient waters from which the world began. These primordial forces are represented by Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea. Conflict grows, Apsu is defeated, Tiamat gathers monstrous allies and prepares for war. The gods are terrified. Then Marduk makes an offer. He will fight Tiamat, but if he wins, the other gods must make him their king. They agree. Marduk receives extraordinary weapons, storm winds, a bow, a net, lightning, and a terrifying divine force. He confronts Tiamat, defeats her, and splits her immense body apart. From one portion he forms the sky, from another the foundations of the world below. It is a violent creation story. Order is not gently planted like a garden. It is built from a defeated chaos. And once Marduk has won, he does something that would have felt deeply meaningful to Babylonian scholars. He organizes the heavens. He establishes stations for the great gods. He sets the stars in their courses. He arranges the constellations. He marks the year. He sets boundaries for the moon. He gives the moon its phases and assigns it the task of measuring time. The sun, too, has its ordered path. The cosmos becomes legible. Not simple, not harmless, but structured. Picture what that means in a world of unpredictable rivers, crop failures, wars, and sudden disease. The sky, which had seemed vast and sometimes frightening, is presented as something arranged. The moving lights have places, time has divisions. The year has markers. The universe is no longer the uncontrolled body of Tiamat. It has become a kingdom, with Marduk as its ruler. This is the setting in which Nibiru appears. The word is usually connected with the Akkadian idea of crossing, passage, or ford. A ford is a place where a river can be crossed. So even in its basic meaning, Nibiru suggests movement from one side to another, a point of transition, a place where paths meet. In celestial language, that could refer to a crossing point in the sky, a station on a heavenly route, or a particular celestial body associated with such a position. The Enuma Elish uses Nibiru in language that places it among Marduk's cosmic titles and functions. In one important passage after Marduk establishes order in the heavens, Nibiru is associated with fixing the positions of stars and helping maintain the boundaries of the celestial realm. The exact translation and interpretation of every line has been debated. Ancient texts rarely make things easy for us. A single term can shift meaning depending on context, period, and scribal tradition. But the basic point is clear. Nibiru is not introduced as a rogue planet that returns every few thousand years to smash the Earth. It belongs to an ordered cosmos. It is connected to regulation, position, passage, and divine authority. In later Mesopotamian astronomical and astrological texts, Nibiru could be used in different ways. In some contexts, scholars identify it with Jupiter. That association makes sense within Babylonian religion because Jupiter was closely linked with Marduk. Of the visible planets, Jupiter is bright, steady, and majestic. It moves slowly through the stars, taking nearly 12 years to complete its circuit of the zodiac. To observers without telescopes, it would have seemed less erratic than Mercury, less startlingly brilliant than Venus, less blood-coloured than Mars, but still unmistakably important. Jupiter was the kingly planet. Marduk was the king of the gods. The association is not difficult to understand. but Nibiru may not always mean Jupiter. In some texts it seems to indicate a celestial station or crossing point rather than one permanent object. In others, the term may be used more flexibly, depending on what body was occupying a significant place in the sky. This is one reason modern claims about Nibiru can become confusing. People want one word to have one fixed meaning. Ancient languages often refuse to cooperate. Imagine asking whether the English word crossing means a road intersection, a river ford, a railway crossing, a border crossing, or the act of moving from one place to another. The answer depends on the sentence. Nibiru works a little like that. Its meaning has a centre, the idea of passage or crossing, but its exact application can vary. And this is where the temptation begins. The Enuma Elish is dramatic. It contains ancient waters, celestial organization, divine warfare, monsters, destruction, and a world made after a great battle. It talks about the heavens with seriousness and precision. It comes from a civilization famous for tracking planets and eclipses across generations. If you are already looking for evidence that ancient people knew of a returning disaster planet, it can feel like the perfect text. A god defeats a chaos monster. The heavens are rearranged. Nibiru appears in a cosmic passage. Surely, later writers have suggested, this must be a memory of a planetary collision, a near impact, or a celestial disaster encoded in myth. But that conclusion adds far more than the tablets actually say. Myths can use the language of nature without being eyewitness reports of natural events. A storm god can represent storms. A sea monster can represent the terrifying power of the sea. A cosmic battle can express political change, ritual renewal, or the basic human fear that order might collapse. None of that makes the story false or meaningless. It simply means myth has its own way of telling truth. The Enuma Elish tells its audience that Babylon's god is powerful enough to make a stable world from danger. It explains why Marduk deserves kingship. It gives cosmic weight to the order of temple, city, calendar, and king. When it was recited during Babylon's New Year festival, it was not merely describing a distant beginning. It was renewing the idea that chaos could be held back, that the world could be set right again. That idea is powerful, maybe too powerful to leave alone. Later readers, especially those drawn to hidden knowledge and ancient catastrophe theories, found in Nibiru a word that sounded mysterious, a creation epic full of cosmic violence, and just enough uncertainty to build an entire modern prophecy around it. But the ancient text itself points somewhere quieter, and in some ways more interesting, toward a people trying to understand how a universe of frightening forces could still contain roots, boundaries, seasons, and a return to order. If the Enuma Elish gives us the mythic version of an ordered sky, the MUL.APIN tablets show us something even more remarkable: the working version. MUL.APIN is the name given to a major Mesopotamian astronomical compendium, a collection of observations, star lists, seasonal markers, and practical instructions copied onto clay tablets. The name comes from its opening words, usually translated as the plough. That was the name of a constellation, not unlike our Big Dipper, and it was one of the first landmarks in the ancient northern sky. The surviving copies mostly come from the first millennium BCE, especially from the great library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. But scholars generally think much of the material was assembled earlier, perhaps around 1000 BCE, drawing on traditions that were older still. So, when we read MUL.APIN, we are not looking at one person suddenly inventing astronomy. We are looking at generations of scribes comparing notes with the sky. And the sky, unlike a king or a merchant or a river, was remarkably patient. Every night it returned. Not exactly the same, but close enough to be studied. Stars rose a little earlier as the year progressed. Certain constellations appeared near the horizon at predictable times. the sun moved north and south through the seasons. The moon changed shape, disappeared, and returned. 5 wandering lights moved against the fixed background of stars. They were the planets visible without a telescope: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. For Mesopotamian scholars, these were not just beautiful things to look at. They were a calendar written across the darkness. MUL.APIN organizes the visible heavens with an impressive mixture of practicality and imagination. It lists stars and constellations associated with 3 great divine regions: the path of Anu, the path of Enlil, and the path of Ea. You can think of these as broad bands of the sky. Anu's region lay in the middle, around the celestial equator. Enlil's lay to the north, Ea's lay to the south. It was not a modern coordinate system. There were no degrees of right ascension, no computerized star maps, no telescope observatories rotating silently under a dome. But it was a serious attempt to classify the sky, to divide its enormous confusion into recognizable routes. And that is harder than it sounds. Go outside on a clear night with no map, no compass, and no previous knowledge. At first, the sky feels crowded but random. Thousands of points of light. Some bright, some faint, some clustered together, some barely visible through haze. The ancient astronomers had to turn that glittering confusion into a system people could remember, teach, copy, and use. So they named patterns. They tracked first risings and final settings. They noticed which stars appeared before dawn at particular times of year. They linked celestial events to agricultural and administrative needs. When a star first emerged from the sun's glare in the eastern morning sky, it could help signal a seasonal change. When another vanished in the west, it could mark another stage in the year. This mattered in a land shaped by rivers, planting, harvests, taxation, temple rituals, and royal schedules. A calendar was not just an abstract chart hanging on a wall. It told people when to prepare fields, when to expect seasonal conditions, when festivals should be held, and when a king's rituals had to be performed correctly. In other words, the stars were part of the machinery of civilization. MUL.APIN also contains material about the lengths of day and night across the year, the use of water clocks, the positions of the moon, and the behavior of planets. It reflects a world in which observation had become systematic enough that scribes could notice patterns extending over many years. That does not mean they had modern astronomy. They did not know that Earth orbits the Sun. They did not possess Newton's laws, gravity, or the vast distances between planets. Their universe was geocentric because, from the ground, that is what the universe appears to be. The Earth seems still, the sky seems to turn, the sun rises, the stars wheel overhead. If you lived before telescopes, and especially if you lived in a city where the sky was read as a divine text, this was not foolish. It was the evidence of your senses, carefully organized, and they organized it extremely well. This is important when we return to Nibiru. Modern Nibiru theories often imagine an unknown giant planet on a huge orbit, disappearing into deep space for thousands of years, and then returning near Earth to trigger floods, pole shifts, earthquakes, or a global reset. It is dramatic. It is also the exact kind of thing people hope an ancient astronomical text will secretly reveal. After all, if Babylonian scholars were tracking planets, maybe they knew about one more planet. Maybe MUL.APIN contains the hidden instruction manual. Maybe its references to celestial crossings and wandering stars point to an object that comes back when humanity has forgotten it. But the surviving text does not give us that. Its planetary material fits much better with what we would expect from careful naked-eye observation of the known visible planets. These lights could be followed because they moved in regular, recognizable ways. Jupiter, associated in some contexts with Nibiru, was especially significant. It was bright, slow-moving, and linked with Marduk, Babylon's great god. Saturn moved more slowly still. Mars could flare red. Venus could shine with almost alarming brilliance before sunrise or after sunset. Mercury was elusive, appearing briefly near the horizon, like a messenger who refuses to stay for the meeting. These were wandering stars, but they were not unpredictable intruders. Their movements were complicated, sometimes confusing, occasionally surprising. Yet over time, they returned to familiar regions of the sky. That was exactly why scribes could record them. A hidden doomsday planet is a different kind of claim entirely. It would need clear evidence, descriptions that distinguish it from Jupiter or another known planet, observations of an extraordinarily long repeating cycle, warnings tied specifically to its return, perhaps calculations showing when it would appear again. The surviving MUL.APIN material does not provide an unambiguous record of anything like that. There are celestial omens in Mesopotamian culture. There are fears of eclipses, strange weather, comets, and unusual planetary appearances. There are myths of chaos and renewal. But those things should not be stacked together like bricks until they become a planet the tablets never plainly describe. What MUL.APIN reveals is, in some ways, more extraordinary than a lost prophecy. It shows human beings learning that the sky had patterns. Not perfect patterns, not patterns that made life safe. A flood could still come, a king could still die, a harvest could still fail. But above all that uncertainty, the stars continued their slow appointments. A constellation rose where it had risen before. The moon returned from darkness. The planets wandered, but not without roots. And once people learned to recognize those roots, the heavens became more than a source of fear. They became something that could be studied, something that could be copied onto clay, something that could perhaps offer warning when the ordinary order of the world seemed about to change. And this is where Mesopotamian sky watching becomes more unsettling, because a sky with patterns can offer comfort, but it can also offer warnings. The ancient scribes did not simply ask when Jupiter would rise, or which star marked the coming season. They also asked what it meant when the expected order was disturbed. What did it mean if the moon darkened during an eclipse? What if Venus vanished at the wrong time? What if Mars appeared unusually bright, or a halo surrounded the moon, or a comet cut across the sky like a scratch on a tablet? For answers they turned to vast omen collections. The most famous of these is called Enuma, Anu, Enlil, usually translated as When Anu and Enlil. It was a sprawling series of clay tablets, copied and expanded over centuries, containing thousands of conditional observations. If this happens in the sky, then that may happen on Earth. If the moon is eclipsed in a certain part of the night, the king may face danger. If Jupiter appears in a particular region of the sky, the land may prosper. If Venus rises strangely, perhaps an enemy army will move. If thunder comes in an unexpected month, perhaps crops will fail, rivers will rise, or distant lands will become unstable. To modern ears, this can sound like fortune-telling. And in one sense it was. But it was not random fortune-telling. It was an attempt to build a system out of uncertainty. Imagine generations of scribes recording events. An eclipse occurs. A king dies months later. That coincidence is remembered. A strange planetary conjunction appears. There is famine, rebellion, or a military defeat. That too is copied down over time. The records grow. Later scholars inherit them, compare new events to old entries, and search for the pattern. It is a very human response to living in a dangerous world. Mesopotamia was a place of immense wealth, but also immense vulnerability. Rivers could nourish fields or destroy them. Armies could appear from beyond the horizon. Cities rose, fought, paid tribute, rebelled, and sometimes vanished. A bad harvest was not merely disappointing. It could mean hunger, debt, disease, unrest, and war. So the question behind an omen was rarely abstract. It was usually, is the kingdom safe? The signs in Enuma, Anu, Enlil concerned kings, battles, enemies, rainfall, harvests, epidemics, and political disorder. They might refer to Babylon, Assyria, Elam, or other lands known to Mesopotamian scribes. The sky was imagined as a message board on which the gods announced pressures building in the human world. Not always a clear message, of course. The heavens, like government paperwork, could be complicated. An eclipse was especially serious. The moon was not simply a pale object passing through Earth's shadow. It was associated with the moon god's sin, and its sudden darkening could suggest that normal cosmic order had been interrupted. Solar eclipses could be even more alarming. In the middle of the day, the sun weakened. Birds became confused. Temperatures dropped. The world briefly behaved as though night had arrived early. If you had no modern explanation, it would be hard not to feel that something enormous had gone wrong. But Mesopotamian scholars did not respond by giving up. They responded by calculating, consulting tablets, performing rituals, and advising the court. A threatening sign did not necessarily mean disaster was unavoidable. It meant action was required. This is an important distinction. The omen was not always treated as a fixed prediction of doom. It was more like a warning that the relationship between the gods, the king, and the kingdom needed repair. Priests and diviners could perform rituals intended to avert evil, redirect it, or limit its effects. These rites are often called Namburbi rituals, a term associated with undoing or releasing an ominous consequence. Offerings might be made, prayers could be spoken, objects connected with the omen might be symbolically purified or destroyed. The point was not to command the universe. The point was to restore balance before the danger reached its full force. And nowhere does this political anxiety become clearer than in the substitute king ritual. When an eclipse or another especially dangerous omen seemed to threaten the actual ruler, the court could appoint a substitute king. For a limited period, another man would be dressed, named, and treated as king. Meanwhile, the real king withdrew from public view. The logic was chillingly practical. If the omen had announced danger to the king, then perhaps the danger would fall upon the temporary king instead. The substitute was not always a random victim dragged in from the street. The details varied across time and place, and our records are incomplete. But the ritual carried an unmistakable burden. The substitute could receive royal clothing, food, and ceremony, while everyone understood that his reign was not meant to last. At the end of the danger period, he could be removed, and in some known cases killed, along with the woman assigned as his queen. Then the real king returned. It is tempting to see this only as superstition. But it was also politics under extreme pressure. Kings were not merely private individuals in Mesopotamian thought. Their health, legitimacy, and ritual correctness were bound to the stability of the whole land. If a king was threatened, fields, armies, temples, and cities could all seem threatened with him. The sky, in this sense, spoke most loudly to power. Still, we should be careful not to turn these omen texts into something they were not. Enuma, Anu, Enlil does not present a timetable for a recurring worldwide reset. It does not describe a hidden planet returning on a vast schedule to wipe out civilization. Its omens are local, conditional, and deeply tied to the concerns of particular kingdoms. A lunar eclipse might warn of danger to a ruler. An unusual wind might suggest crop failure. A planetary appearance might concern war in a neighbouring region. These were attempts to interpret the fragile present, not calculations of an inevitable global apocalypse. And yet, beneath all the rituals and royal fears, there was a real intellectual achievement. The scribes had learned that celestial events could be observed, categorized, compared, and remembered. Even when they interpreted the sky through gods and omens, they were building records. They were noticing repetition. They were trying to separate ordinary events from unusual ones. In time, that patient attention to cycles would lead toward something quieter than prophecy. It would lead toward calendars, predictions, and the ancient dream that time itself could be made understandable. That dream began with a simple problem. How do you know when the next season is coming? For people who planted crops, moved herds, collected taxes, arranged festivals, or sent armies across difficult ground, time was not an abstract idea. Time was food, time was water, time was whether a journey began under clear skies or ended with men and animals trapped in mud. And the most reliable clock anyone could see was hanging overhead. The moon was the obvious place to start. It changed shape in a rhythm that required no temple library and no royal astronomer to notice. A thin crescent appeared after sunset. It grew night by night. It became full and bright enough to cast shadows. Then it shrank, vanished, and returned. A complete lunar cycle lasts about 29.5 days. Ancient people did not need the decimal to understand the pattern. They could count the nights. This is why so many early calendars were based on lunar months. In Mesopotamia, as in many other places, a new month could begin when observers saw the first thin crescent of the new moon. Officials watched the western horizon after sunset. If the crescent appeared, the month began. If clouds hid it, uncertainty entered the system. A kingdom could be waiting for a sliver of light. 12 lunar months make a year that is roughly 11 days shorter than the solar year. And that small difference creates a surprisingly large problem. If you follow the moon alone, your months slowly drift through the seasons. A festival meant for spring eventually arrives in winter. A harvest tax might be scheduled before the grain is ready. A calendar that once matched the world outside begins slipping loose from it, like a rope coming untied. So ancient calendar makers had to solve a problem that is still with us today. The moon says one thing, the sun says another. The solar year, measured by the return of seasons and the changing position of the sun, is about 365.25 days long. The lunar year is shorter. You cannot make the two agree perfectly. But you can keep correcting them. This is where intercalation comes in. It sounds technical, but the basic idea is very simple. Every few years add an extra month. Mesopotamian rulers and scribes inserted these additional months to pull the lunar calendar back into alignment with the agricultural year. In earlier periods, this may have been done when observation showed that the calendar was drifting too far from the seasons. Later, more regular systems emerged. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian scholars had developed increasingly sophisticated ways of coordinating lunar months with the solar year. They were not just staring at the sky and making vague notes. They were measuring recurrence, comparing records, correcting errors, building a workable model of time that matters because it shows what ancient astronomy was usually trying to do. Not predict a secret object beyond the edge of sight. Not identify a planet that vanished for thousands of years and returned to destroy the world. The immediate goal was much more practical and, in its own way, much more impressive. When should the month begin? When will the river rise? When should a ritual be held? When is the right season to sow barley? When can a king expect an eclipse? And how much warning does the court have? These questions required attention not just to one dramatic event, but to the ordinary rhythm of the heavens, the kind of rhythm that repeats so patiently that a human life can begin to trust it. The sun returns to its seasonal path. The moon returns to its phases. The bright planets wander, but they wander in recognizable ways. Venus was especially striking. It appears as the morning star before sunrise, then disappears into the sun's glare, then returns as the evening star after sunset. To ancient observers, it could seem like two different lights, one rising before the day and one arriving after it. But careful watchers understood that these appearances belonged to a repeating pattern. The famous Venus tablet of Amisaduqa records observations of Venus's first and last visibility over many years. The exact historical interpretation of the tablet is complicated, and scholars debate how precisely its observations can be tied to absolute dates. But its larger meaning is clear enough. Babylonian scribes were tracking Venus carefully, watching when it disappeared, when it returned, and how its movements related to the calendar. And Venus has a rhythm that is almost designed to catch the human imagination. 5 of its visible cycles are close to 8 solar years. Over long periods, its appearances form beautiful repeating relationships with the Sun and Earth. Ancient people did not need modern orbital mechanics to recognize that Venus kept appointments. Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Mercury also had their patterns. They moved against the background of stars. Sometimes they slowed. Sometimes they appeared to reverse direction, a phenomenon we now call retrograde motion. To people watching from Earth, the planets did not travel in simple lines. They wandered, they paused, they turned back. But they did so with enough regularity to be recorded. That regularity changed the way people could imagine the universe. A sky of random lights is frightening because nothing can be anticipated. A sky of cycles is different. It may still be full of omens and divine warnings, but it is also a place where events return. And once you begin to see return in the heavens, it becomes tempting to see return everywhere else. Winter returns, floods return, droughts return, dynasties rise, weaken, collapse, and are replaced. A king dies, another is crowned. Cities are built on the ruins of older cities. Children inherit fields, debts, stories, and fears from their parents. Perhaps history itself moves in circles. This was not a single doctrine shared by every ancient civilization. Different societies imagined time differently. Some emphasized renewal. Some imagined long ages. Some told stories of earlier worlds destroyed by flood, fire, or divine judgment. Others focused more narrowly on annual ritual and the restoration of order. But the heavens made cyclical thinking feel plausible. If the moon can die into darkness and return 3 nights later, perhaps death is not final. If the sun weakens in winter and comes back in spring, perhaps a broken world can be renewed. If Venus vanishes and appears again in another part of the sky, perhaps disappearance is only part of a larger pattern. There is a quiet comfort in that idea. There is also a danger, because a real repeating cycle can encourage people to search for cycles where the evidence is much weaker. If eclipses return, perhaps disasters return on a schedule. If seasons return, perhaps civilizations must also rise and fall according to a cosmic timetable. If planets can be predicted, perhaps some unseen planet is waiting beyond the darkness, moving toward its appointed hour. But this is where the evidence becomes very different. The moon, sun, and visible planets were known through repeated observation. People could see them, track them, notice when predictions worked and when calendar corrections were needed. Their cycles were not perfect in the way ancient observers imagined, but they were real, visible, and testable. A long-hidden orbital intruder is another matter entirely. There is no ancient Mesopotamian calendar that records a returning Nibiru on a vast destruction cycle. No surviving tablet provides a reliable schedule for a planet sweeping back through the inner solar system every few thousand years. The astronomical traditions we have been discussing depended on visible repetition, not an invisible catastrophe whose previous visits left no clear observational record. Still, the leap is understandable. For thousands of years, human beings watched the sky and learned that change was not always chaos. Some changes came back. Some could be counted, some could be prepared for. And in a world where floods, famine, war and disease could overturn everything, the hope that even disaster might follow a pattern had a strange appeal. A pattern means warning. A warning means preparation. And preparation, even when it rests on uncertain beliefs, can feel like a small victory over the darkness. That ancient desire for predictable time would take many forms. In some places, it would become an astonishingly precise calendar. In others, it would become a story about recurring ages, destroyed worlds, and renewal after catastrophe. And nowhere has that connection between time, endings, and renewal been more famously misunderstood than in the calendars of the ancient Maya. The Maya did not have one calendar. They had several, working together, each measuring a different kind of time. This is important because the popular story usually begins with a single mysterious calendar supposedly counting down toward the end of everything. But the actual Maya system was more like a set of interlocking gears. Some gears tracked ritual days, some tracked the seasonal year. Some tracked immense stretches of history, and none of them by themselves required the world to end when a number reached a particular point. The best known of these systems is the long count. The long count was a way of numbering days from a mythic starting point conventionally correlated by most scholars to August 11, 3114 BCE in our modern calendar, though exact correlations between Maya and modern dates have been debated. The Maya did not necessarily think the world physically began on that day in the simple sense we might mean. It was more like a deep point of origin in sacred time, the opening of the current era. From there, days could be counted forward. The system was mostly based on 20s. 20 days made a uinal. 18 uinals made a ton of 360 days, a number close to the solar year. 20 tons made a katon. 20 katons made a baketon, a period of 144,000 days, or just under 394 solar years. A long count date might look like a string of numbers, 13.0.0. To someone unfamiliar with the system, it can seem like a code. To a Maya scribe, it was a date, a very large, very precise date, capable of locating an event within a vast flow of time. Alongside the long count was the calendar round. This was created by combining two shorter calendars. The first was the Tzolk'in, a ritual cycle of 260 days. It paired 20-day names with 13 numbers, 1 emix, 2 ik, 3 akbal, and so on, until the combinations eventually repeated after 260 days. We still do not know with complete certainty why this cycle had 260 days. It may have been connected to agricultural rhythms, human gestation, the movements of celestial bodies, or older systems whose original meanings changed over time. But for the Maya, it was deeply important. It organized ceremonies, divination, personal names, and the sacred character of particular days. The second was the Harb, a solar calendar of 365 days. It contained 18 months of 20 days, plus a final 5-day period called Weib. Those 5 extra days were often treated as an unsettled time, a small crack in the ordinary order of the year, when caution was wise and the boundaries between things might feel less secure. Put the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Harb together, and their exact combination repeated every 52 Harb years. This was the calendar round, so a person could be born under a particular pairing of ritual and seasonal dates, then see that same pairing return only once or twice in an ordinary lifetime. It gave time a feeling of recurrence, not a straight road leading from a beginning to a final wall, but a patterned landscape where familiar alignments returned. And yet the long count reached beyond those returning cycles. This is one of the remarkable things about Maya inscriptions. Kings did not simply record events in the recent past. They placed royal births, accessions, wars, dedications, and rituals within enormous chronological frameworks. A ruler's ceremony could be linked to mythic events in the distant past, as though the actions of a living court were echoes of sacred events that had unfolded thousands of years earlier. Time was not small. It could stretch backward into creation and forward beyond the lives of kingdoms. That brings us to the famous date, 13.U.0.0.0. In the long count, this date fell in December 2012. It marked the completion of 13 Baktuns since the era's starting point. And for a brief, strange period in the early 21st century, millions of people became convinced that the ancient Maya had predicted a global reset. Some expected earthquakes, pole shifts, solar storms, a collision with Planet X, the return of Nibiru, or a spiritual transformation so total that the old world would simply disappear. But a calendar turnover is not automatically an apocalypse. Our own calendar moved from 1999 to 2000. The numbers changed. There was celebration, anxiety, and a few nervous predictions about computers failing. But nobody seriously believed that the existence of a new millennium proved the planet had reached its final day. The Maya celebrated endings of periods because endings mattered. A completed cycle was a powerful moment. It could call for ritual, memorials, political display, and renewed attention to the gods. But completion is not the same thing as annihilation. In fact, Maya texts could refer to dates far beyond 2012. At the Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque, an inscription links the life of the ruler Kinich Janab Pakal to an anniversary projected far into the future, in the year 4772 by the most common correlation. The text is damaged and interpretation has details that scholars still discuss, but the basic point is hard to miss. Maya scribes were perfectly capable of imagining time continuing well beyond the 13th Baktun. Other inscriptions also show a willingness to reach backward into immense mythic distances, using higher units beyond the Baktun when the occasion demanded it. The machinery of the long count did not stop at 2012. The numbers could keep moving, which makes the Maya very different from the modern Nibiru story. In Mesopotamia, Nibiru was a term with several meanings, often connected to a crossing point or, in certain texts, to a celestial identity such as Jupiter or Marduk. It belonged to a world of omens, planets, kingship, and careful sky watching. It was not a Maya calendar date. It was not part of the long count, and there is no ancient bridge connecting Maya timekeeping to a returning hidden planet. That bridge was built much later out of internet rumour, modern prophecy, and a very human habit of turning a date on a calendar into a door at the end of the world. The Maya, meanwhile, had been doing something quieter and more difficult. They were counting time carefully enough to hold together the day of a ritual, the turning of the year, the memory of ancestors, the authority of kings, and the deep ages of creation. And when one great cycle ended, they did not necessarily see darkness ahead. They saw another number waiting to be counted, and this is where the modern story begins. Not in a Maya city, not in the carved inscriptions of Palenque or Copan, not in some secret tablet buried beneath a temple floor. It began much later in books, television documentaries, New Age workshops, disaster forums, and eventually the fast-moving rumour machine of the early internet. By the 1970s and 1980s, a number of popular writers had begun looking at Maya calendars through a very modern lens. They saw the approaching date of December 2012 and asked a question that Maya scribes do not appear to have asked in the same way. What happens when the count reaches 13? For some writers, the answer was not simply another date. It was transformation, a shift in consciousness, the end of one age and the birth of another. This idea fit neatly with a growing spiritual culture that blended meditation, astrology, ancient civilizations, environmental concern, UFO stories, and a deep suspicion that official history was hiding something important. One influential figure was José Argüelles, whose 1987 event called The Harmonic Convergence presented Maya time as part of a coming spiritual awakening. Argüelles was not working from a straightforward reading of ancient Maya inscriptions. He developed his own symbolic system, combining Maya-inspired ideas with modern esoteric thought. But the message was powerful. Humanity, he suggested, was moving toward a special threshold. Then came other writers, each adding another piece. Some focused on the long count. Some connected 2012 to a supposed alignment between the December solstice sun and the center of the Milky Way. Others brought in prophecies from many different cultures. Still others connected the date to a hidden planet called Nibiru, a massive object supposedly moving through the darkness beyond Neptune, preparing to return to the inner solar system. By the early 2000s, these separate claims had begun merging into one enormous story. The Maya had predicted a final date. The galaxy was about to align. Ancient Mesopotamians had known about a wandering planet. Governments were covering it up, and somehow all of this pointed to December 21, 2012. It was an impressive construction, but it was a construction. The Maya long count, Mesopotamian Nibiru traditions, modern ideas about galactic alignment, and stories of Planet X came from different places, different centuries, and completely different intellectual worlds. They did not form one ancient system of prophecy waiting to be decoded. The connection between them was mostly made by modern people. Take the galactic alignment claim. The basic astronomical observation was real enough. Because of a slow movement called precession, the position of the solstice sun shifts gradually against the background stars over thousands of years. Around the era of 2012, the December solstice occurred in the general region of the sky associated with the Milky Way's central band. But general region is doing a lot of work here. The center of the Milky Way is not a single bright target marked with a line in the sky. It is a distant direction in space, obscured by dust, interpreted through modern astronomy. The proposed alignment was not a sudden, exact, once-in-history cosmic event. It unfolded gradually over decades, and there is little evidence that ancient Maya astronomers identified it as a countdown to the end of the world. Then there was Nibiru. The Nibiru Panic had its own modern history, largely separate from Maya calendrics. In the 1990s, claims circulated online that a hidden planet or brown dwarf was approaching Earth. One version predicted disaster in 2003. When 2003 passed without a planetary collision, the prediction did not disappear. It moved. The new date was 2012. This is one of the strange survival skills of apocalyptic prophecy. A failed prediction can be treated not as a failure, but as evidence that the date was misunderstood, the warning was delayed, or the truth had been concealed. The story adjusts. The fear remains. Movies helped. Television helped. Magazine covers helped. Search engines helped most of all. Type 2012 prophecy into an early internet search bar, and you could quickly fall into a maze of videos, countdown clocks, satellite images, ancient symbols, and urgent voices explaining that the pieces finally fit together. A Maya monument in Mexico, a Babylonian word, a solar flare, a magnetic pole shift, a government bunker, and a blurry photograph of the sun could all become evidence for the same approaching event. But putting things next to each other does not prove they belong together. A Maya date is not automatically a Mesopotamian omen. A Babylonian celestial term is not evidence for a hidden planet. A dramatic astronomical coincidence is not a prophecy. And an ancient culture's belief that time moved in great cycles does not mean it predicted a modern disaster with a date, a mechanism, and a global audience. Still, the story had an enormous emotional appeal. A fixed date is intoxicating. It turns vague unease into a scheduled appointment. It suggests that hidden knowledge exists, that the ordinary world is only a surface, and that someone, somewhere, has seen the pattern before everyone else. If the future feels confusing, a countdown can feel strangely comforting. At least it offers an answer. At least it tells you when the waiting ends. And then December 21, 2012 arrived. People woke up. Planes crossed the sky. Oceans remained in their basins. The hidden planet did not appear. The world did not reset. There were celebrations, jokes, disappointed believers, and plenty of people quietly moving on to the next prediction. But the passing of 2012 left behind something useful. It showed the difference between cultural fascination and reliable evidence. The Maya calendar was real. Their astronomy was real. Their deep attention to cycles, ritual endings, and sacred time was real. But the modern apocalypse built around 2012 was mostly a story about us. Our anxieties, our hunger for revelation, our willingness to braid together fragments from distant cultures until they seem to speak with one voice. And the ancient Maya, who had counted far beyond 2012, would probably have recognized something simple in all of it. A great cycle had ended. Then another day began. The Maya were not the only people to look at the sky and see time as a pattern. Along the Nile, thousands of years earlier, Egyptian priests, farmers, kings, and labourers lived inside a rhythm so dependable that it shaped nearly every part of life. Not a countdown to one final disaster, not a hidden planet approaching from darkness. Something both more practical and more sacred. The river rose. The fields flooded. The waters withdrew. Seeds went into black mud. Green life returned, and above it all the sun disappeared each evening, travelled through the unseen world of night, and rose again. For the Egyptians, the universe was not a machine that had been built once and left alone. It had to be renewed constantly. Every dawn was a victory. Every successful flood was a restoration. Every year that the Nile returned was proof that order had survived another encounter with chaos. They called that order Mat. Mat is one of those ancient words that carries more meaning than any single English translation can hold. It can mean truth, balance, justice, rightness, harmony, and the proper arrangement of the world. It was the condition in which the sun rose when it should rise. The Nile flooded when it should flood. Courts judged fairly. Families honoured their obligations, and the king performed the rituals expected of him. If Mat held, Egypt held. But beyond Mat was its opposite, often described as Isfet. Disorder, violence, falsehood, drought, rebellion. The terrifying possibility that the boundaries separating life from death, land from water, and daylight from darkness could collapse. This did not mean Egyptians expected one scheduled day when the whole world would end. Their fear was more immediate, and in some ways more understandable. What if the river failed? What if enemies invaded? What if the king neglected the gods? What if the sun, after all its previous returns, did not come back? Because in Egypt, nature was never merely nature. The annual flood of the Nile was water, silt, and agricultural necessity. But it was also a sacred event. The inundation transformed the dry landscape, spreading across the floodplain and leaving behind rich dark soil. Without it, Egyptian civilization could not have flourished in the desert. The Egyptians divided their year around this pattern. Akhet was the season of inundation when the river rose. Peret was the season of emergence and growing, when the waters retreated and crops began to rise. Shemu was the harvest season, when grain was gathered before the cycle began again. It was a calendar built around renewal, and one of the most important signs came from the sky. Each year, near the beginning of the flood season, the star Sirius briefly appeared in the dawn sky just before the sun. This first visible appearance after a period of absence is called its heliacal rising. To Egyptians, Sirius was associated with the goddess Sopdet, later linked with Isis. Its return was a celestial announcement that the life-giving waters were near. Imagine what that must have felt like. For weeks, Sirius has been hidden in the sun's glare. Then, in the pale light before dawn, it appears again, a bright point returning from invisibility. Soon after, the river begins to swell. The land that looked dry and exhausted prepares to become fertile once more. There is no need for a giant unseen world to explain the emotional force of this moment. The sky and river were already speaking together. Egyptian religion gave this renewal an even deeper shape through the sun god Ra. Every day Ra crossed the sky in his solar boat. Every evening he vanished below the western horizon. But he was not simply gone. During the night, Egyptian texts imagined him travelling through the Duat, the dangerous hidden realm beneath the world. There, Ra faced darkness, hostile beings, and the great serpent Apophis or Apep, a force of destruction that threatened to stop the sun's journey forever. Night after night, the danger returned. Night after night, Ra overcame it. And at dawn the sun rose again. That is the crucial difference. Egyptian cosmic danger was real within the mythic imagination, but it was not primarily a forecast of unavoidable planetary reset. It was a repeating struggle. Chaos could attack, order could weaken. But through divine effort, ritual attention, and the maintenance of Maat, the world was renewed. Egyptian myths did sometimes imagine destruction on a larger scale. In one famous story, humanity becomes rebellious, and the sun god sends the goddess Hathor to punish them. The slaughter grows so terrible that Ra eventually stops it by tricking Hathor with beer dyed red, to resemble blood. She drinks, becomes intoxicated, and the survivors remain. It is a dark story, but it is not a Nibiru story. No returning planet causes the crisis. No astronomical timetable predicts it. The myth is concerned with divine anger, human disorder, mercy, and the fragile continuation of the world. That fragile continuation mattered more than a final ending. The Egyptians knew floods could be too low or too high. They knew crops could fail. They knew kingdoms could fracture. Their confidence in renewal was not naive. It existed because they understood how much depended on the cycle continuing. So when modern writers search Egyptian religion for evidence of an ancient global reset prediction, they often find something different. They find a civilization deeply aware of danger, but equally committed to restoration. A people who watched the river, the star, and the sunrise, and saw not one great appointment with destruction, but countless chances for the world to be set right again. And from the Nile, the idea of repeating ages and recurring catastrophe would travel into another world of myth. Across the Mediterranean, Greek poets and philosophers were also asking whether human history moved forward in a line, or whether it turned in circles. The Greeks gave that question some of its most memorable answers. Did human life begin in a better age and slowly decline? Did the gods sometimes wipe out a corrupt generation and begin again? Did the whole cosmos itself pass through destruction and rebirth, over and over, with no final ending at all? For Greek poets, these were not small questions. They were ways of explaining why life could feel so difficult in a world that seemed, at least in stories, to have once been closer to the gods. Around the 7th century BCE, the poet Hesiod described a sequence of human ages in his poem Works and Days. He did not present it as an astronomical calculation. There is no hidden planet, no timetable carved into the sky, no date when the next reset must arrive. It is a moral story about decline, labour, violence, and the loss of an easier world. First came the Golden Race. These people lived under the rule of Kronos before Zeus became king of the gods. Hesiod says they lived like gods, free from hard labour, with no miserable old age, and with the earth producing food in abundance. Death came gently to them like falling asleep. Then came the Silver Race, less noble, less wise, and unable to honour the gods properly. Zeus destroyed them. After them came the Bronze Race, fierce and violent people whose world was filled with weapons, warfare, and eventually self-destruction. But Hesiod's pattern is not perfectly simple. After Bronze, he places the Age of Heroes, the generation of legendary figures associated with Thebes and Troy. Some heroes die in war, but others are granted a better existence at the edges of the world. And then comes Hesiod's own age, the Iron Age. This is the age of exhausting work, conflict between relatives, dishonest rulers, broken promises, and the sense that justice has become harder to find. Hesiod even says he wishes he had not been born into it. It is a familiar feeling, isn't it? The belief that the past was stronger, kinder, cleaner, more honourable, and that the present is somehow the worn-out final version of what history used to be. Every generation has its own version of the Golden Age, and every generation is tempted to imagine that collapse must be near because the world no longer resembles that imagined past. But Hesiod was not predicting a global event from celestial cycles. His ages are made from poetry, ethics, and mythic memory. They explain human suffering by placing it inside a vast story of decline. Greek stories also knew the terror of water. The best-known Greek flood tale centres on Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. In later versions of the story, Zeus sees humanity as violent, arrogant, or corrupt, and decides to destroy it with a great flood. Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus, builds a vessel and survives with Pyrrha as the waters cover the land. When the flood finally recedes, the two survivors face an empty world. They ask an oracle how humanity can return. The answer is strange. Throw the bones of your mother behind you. Deucalion understands that their mother is the earth, and her bones are stones. So he and Pyrrha cast stones over their shoulders. The stones thrown by Deucalion become men. Those thrown by Pyrrha become women. It is a story of destruction, but also of remaking. And once again, the cause is not a wandering planet. It is divine judgment. Greek catastrophe stories usually ask moral questions. What happens when people become violent? What happens when rulers become unjust? What happens when humanity forgets its limits before the gods? If you'd like to explore more ancient puzzles like these, you can find the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. Now, Greek thinkers did not all stop with poetry. Some philosophers began wondering whether the universe itself moved through repeating cycles. The Stoics, a school of philosophy founded in Athens around the 3rd century BCE, imagined a cosmos governed by reason, order, and recurring transformation. In some Stoic accounts, the universe would eventually be consumed in a vast cosmic fire, an ekpyrosis. Then, from that destruction, the cosmos would begin again. Stars, earth, gods, and human lives would return within a renewed world order. It sounds at first a little like a cosmic reset. But the Stoic idea was philosophical speculation. It was an attempt to think through the nature of matter, fate, divine reason, and eternity. Stoics were not reading this schedule from observed planetary movements. They were not saying that a particular object would return every few thousand years and burn the world. That distinction matters. Ancient Greeks watched the heavens carefully. They tracked seasons, lunar phases, eclipses, and the risings and settings of stars. Greek astronomers would later develop sophisticated mathematical models of planetary motion. But Greek myths of flood, declining ages, and cosmic fire belong to a different category. They are stories and theories about meaning. Later readers can blur those categories. They notice that Greeks spoke of ages ending, floods destroying humanity, and worlds returning after fire. Then they place these ideas beside Mesopotamian omens, Egyptian renewal, Maya calendars, or modern claims about Nibiru. Soon, recurring images begin to look like fragments of one lost global forecast. But recurring images do not necessarily come from one source. Floods are common because rivers flood, seas rise, storms kill, and human communities remember disaster. Declining ages are common because people compare their troubled present to an idealized past. Renewed worlds are common because winter becomes spring, night becomes dawn, and ruined cities can be rebuilt. The Greeks did not need a hidden planet to imagine catastrophe. They had the sea, the earthquake, the drought, the plague, the battlefield, and the unpredictable anger of the gods. And they had something else, the stubborn human hope that, after destruction, somehow life might begin again. Far to the east, Indian traditions would take the idea of returning ages and stretch it across timescales so enormous that a single human lifetime would become almost too small to see. Indian traditions would take that idea of returning ages and stretch it across timescales so enormous that a single human lifetime would become almost too small to see. In many Hindu cosmological texts, history does not move in a straight line from beginning to end. It moves through repeating ages called Yugas. Each age has its own character. Each reflects a different condition of human morality, social order, spiritual understanding, and connection to Dharma, the principle that holds the world in balance. The best-known sequence contains 4 yugas. First comes the Satya Yuga, sometimes called the Krita Yuga, an age of truth, stability, and virtue. In traditional descriptions, Dharma stands firmly on all 4 of its legs. People are said to live longer, act more honourably, and exist closer to the sacred order of the universe. Then comes the Treta Yuga. Something has changed. The world is still good, but not quite as whole as before. Dharma has lost one of its legs. Human beings need more rules, more rituals, more effort to remain aligned with what is right. Then comes the Dvapara Yuga, an age of further decline, conflict, and uncertainty. And finally comes the Kali Yuga, the age often associated with quarrels, greed, dishonesty, social disorder, and spiritual forgetfulness. It is easy to see why the Kali Yuga has attracted so much attention. If you live in a troubled time, and every generation feels that it does, the idea that you're living in the last and darkest stage of a vast cycle can feel strangely convincing. Wars, corruption, environmental damage, broken promises, cruelty between neighbours. These do not have to be random failures. They can seem like signs that the age itself is growing old. But the Yugas are not simply a story of doom. After Kali comes renewal. The cycle begins again. The worn-out world gives way eventually to another Satya Yuga. Decline is real, but it is not final. Time is not a road leading toward one permanent catastrophe. It is more like a wheel turning through bright ages and dark ones, through loss and restoration. In some widely known traditional calculations, the 4 yugas have a ratio of 4, 3, 2, and 1. The Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. Dwapara lasts 864,000. Treta lasts 1,296,000. Satya lasts 1,728,000. Together, they form a great cycle called a Mahayuga, lasting 4.32 million years. And that is only the beginning. 1,000 Mahayugas make up a single day in the life of Brahma, the creator god in certain Hindu cosmologies. That day lasts 4.32 billion years. Brahma's night lasts just as long. Worlds arise, endure for immense spans, dissolve, and arise again. Compared with this scale, even the rise and fall of civilizations becomes brief. Empires flash into existence. Cities grow beside rivers. Dynasties claim eternity, then become buried under dust. Somewhere, perhaps, a priest recites an ancient verse. A farmer watches the monsoon clouds. A king orders an inscription carved into stone. And above them all, the cosmic clock continues turning at a pace almost impossible to imagine. But we should be careful here. There is no single Hindu book, no one official calendar, and no perfectly uniform chronology accepted across every region, sect, philosophical school, and historical period. Hindu traditions are vast and diverse. The Yugas appear in different forms across texts such as the Mahabharata, the Puranas, and later commentaries. Their lengths, meanings, and relationship to lived history have been interpreted in more than one way. For some believers, these numbers describe literal cosmic durations. For others, they are symbolic measurements of spiritual decline and renewal. Some modern teachers have proposed shorter cycles or different starting points. Others focus less on arithmetic altogether, seeing the Yugas as a moral framework for understanding the human condition. This diversity matters because modern reset theories often do something much simpler. They find an enormous ancient number. They identify a date for the beginning of Kali Yuga, often placed in traditional reckoning around 3102 BCE. Then they begin subtracting, dividing, aligning, and searching for a deadline. Perhaps the Dark Age is almost over. Perhaps a planetary event marks the transition. Perhaps ancient sages encoded the orbit of a returning object into sacred time itself. But the Yuga system does not provide evidence for Nibiru. Its great cycles are cosmological and religious. They describe the condition of the world, the rhythm of creation and dissolution, and the vastness of time beyond human control. They are not records of a hidden planet passing near Earth at fixed intervals. No ancient Yuga text gives us an astronomical orbit for Nibiru, a predicted close approach, or a timetable for a global impact. The connection is modern. It comes from our own desire to turn ancient mystery into a forecast. And perhaps that desire is understandable. A cycle is comforting in one way. If disaster has happened before, perhaps it has a pattern. If history has a pattern, perhaps we can calculate it. And if we can calculate it, perhaps we will not be caught unaware. But Indian cosmology offers something more unsettling, and maybe more peaceful. It suggests that human beings are not standing at the centre of time with a chart in their hands. We are living inside time, vast, recurring, creative, destructive time. Worlds may pass through darkness, order may weaken. But darkness, in this vision, is never the entire story. And beyond India, another ancient tradition would imagine time moving toward renewal too, though not as an endless wheel. In the old Persian world, history would become a struggle with a final healing waiting at its end. In the old Iranian world, time could be imagined as a battlefield. Not a battlefield in the ordinary human sense, with armies marching across a plain and kings arguing over borders. This was a struggle built into the structure of reality itself. On one side stood Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, associated with truth, light, order, life, and the good creation. On the other stood Angra, the destructive spirit, associated with deception, violence, decay, disease, and death. The world in this vision was not simply trapped in an endless sequence of cosmic seasons. It had a purpose, it had a direction, and that direction was toward healing. The religion we call Zoroastrianism developed over many centuries in the Iranian world. Its earliest sacred hymns, the Gathas, are traditionally connected with Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, though historians still debate when exactly he lived. Later Zoroastrian texts, especially those preserved in Middle Persian, describe an increasingly detailed cosmic history. In some of these accounts, the entire drama of the world unfolds across 12,000 years. The first 3,000 years are a kind of spiritual beginning. Creation exists, but not yet in the dense material form we know. Ahura Mazda foresees the coming attack of the destructive spirit. Then comes the material creation, sky, water, earth, plants, animals and human beings, all made as part of a world that is good but vulnerable. Then the attack begins. Angra enters the created world, bringing death into a place that had been ordered for life. The world becomes mixed, good and evil exist together. Truth and falsehood struggle within kingdoms, families and individual minds. Human beings are not just spectators, their choices matter. Every honest word, every act of generosity, every effort to resist cruelty becomes part of the larger fight. That is a very different way of thinking about disaster. A drought, a war, a plague, the collapse of a kingdom. These could be experienced as terrible events in themselves, but also as signs of a world still caught in conflict. Present hardship did not necessarily mean that order had failed forever. It could mean that the struggle was still underway, and crucially it had an ending. Zoroastrian tradition speaks of a future renovation of the world, often known by the Avestan term Frashokareti. At the end of time, evil is defeated, the dead are restored. Creation is renewed, cleansed and made whole. Later texts describe a future saviour figure, the Saoshyant, who helps bring this final transformation about. Some of the images are dramatic. The dead rise. Humanity passes through a river of molten metal. For the righteous it is said to feel like warm milk. For evil it is purification. Even this frightening image is not quite a vision of annihilation. It is a vision of repair. The damaged world is not discarded and replaced like a broken tool. It is restored. Picture what that means for someone living through a dark historical moment. Your city has been conquered. Your harvest has failed. The old order is gone. The future seems closed. A cosmic story like this offers a way to place suffering inside a larger schedule. The world may be wounded, but it is not meaningless. Evil may be active, but it is not eternal. History is moving somewhere. That can sound a little like the modern language of apocalypse. People today also look at crises and wonder whether they are signs of an approaching turning point. But the difference matters. In a repeating astronomical cycle, catastrophe returns because the heavens repeat. A planet comes back, a comet follows its orbit, a hidden object completes another vast circuit and brings another reset. Time works like a wheel, and Earth suffers the same basic pattern again and again. Zoroastrian final renewal is not really that kind of wheel. Its cosmic ages may be measured and ordered, especially in later tradition, but the point is not that the same disaster endlessly returns. The point is that conflict has a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. The world moves from creation, through mixture and struggle, toward fulfillment. There is no ancient Zoroastrian prediction of Nibiru passing Earth at a fixed interval. No sacred Iranian timetable gives an orbit for a returning planet that destroys civilization every few thousand years. The cosmic schedule is moral and religious, not a piece of hidden astronomy. Still, it is easy to understand why these traditions get drawn into reset theories. They contain great spans of time. They describe world-changing conflict. They promise a final transformation after an age of suffering. To someone searching for ancient warnings, those ingredients can look like a coded forecast. But they tell us more about how people faced uncertainty than about the path of an unseen planet. And they remind us that ancient civilizations did not all imagine time in the same way. For some time turned through repeating ages, for others it declined from a golden beginning. For still others, like the Zoroastrian vision, history was a long moral drama moving toward a repaired world. The future was not merely another collapse. It was the possibility that collapse itself would one day be overcome. Far to the north, another tradition remembered the world ending in fire, flood, and battle. But even there, after the ruin, something green would rise again from the sea. Far to the north, another tradition remembered the world ending in fire, flood, and battle. But even there, after the ruin, something green would rise again from the sea. This was Ragnarok. The word is often translated as the doom of the gods, though its exact meaning has been argued over for centuries. In popular imagination, Ragnarok is the Norse apocalypse, a final battle beneath a darkened sky, with monsters breaking free, gods dying, the earth burning, and the sea swallowing the land. And that is part of the story. But it is not the whole story. Ragnarok is not simply a tale about everything ending. It is a sequence, a long unravelling of order, followed by destruction, and then, quietly, almost unexpectedly, renewal. The fullest surviving account appears in a poem called Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress. In it, a mysterious female speaker tells Odin about the beginning of the world, the fate of the gods, and what will happen when the old order finally breaks apart. Before the final battle comes a terrible winter, the Fimbul winter. 3 winters follow one another, with no summer between them. Snow blows from every direction. Families turn against families. Brothers fight brothers. Kinship, law, and trust begin to fail. That detail matters. The end of the world is not caused only by something falling from the sky. It also comes through human betrayal. The cosmic disaster and the moral disaster are woven together. A broken society belongs to a broken world. Then the signs multiply. The wolf, Fenrir, long feared by the gods, breaks free from his bonds. Another wolf catches the sun and devours it. The moon is taken as well. The stars disappear from the sky. The earth shakes. Mountains collapse. Trees are torn from the ground. The sea rises, and the great Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, thrashes in the waves, sending poison across the land and into the air. For people living in the far north, these were not abstract images. Winter darkness was real. Storms could make the sea seem alive and hostile. Volcanic landscapes, earthquakes, landslides, and long stretches of cold could all make the world feel unstable. But a myth does not need to be a weather report to be shaped by weather. It can take familiar fears and enlarge them until they become cosmic. At Ragnarok, the enemies of the gods arrive. A ship called Naglfar sails over the floodwaters. It is said to be made from the nails of the dead, which is exactly the kind of unsettling detail that stays with you in the middle of a long northern night. Giants gather. The dead come marching. Loki, the trickster god and enemy of the gods, returns to fight beside the forces of chaos. Then comes the battle on the plain called Vigrid. Odin faces Fenrir and is swallowed by the wolf. Thor fights Jormungandr. He kills the serpent, but walks only 9 steps before falling dead from its poison. Freyr confronts the fire giant, Surtur, and dies. Tyr and the wolf Garm kill one another. Loki and Heimdall meet, and neither survives. Almost every great figure of the old world is caught in this final reckoning. And then Surtur spreads fire across the world. The earth burns. The sky is consumed, the world sinks beneath the water. If you encountered this story without its ending, it would sound remarkably close to a modern global reset narrative. Darkness in the sky, climate collapse, earthquakes, rising seas, social violence, the death of the old order. A final catastrophe so complete that nothing seems capable of surviving it. It is easy to see why people sometimes search Ragnarok for evidence of a real ancient impact, a comet, a volcanic winter, or some forgotten planetary disaster. But that is where caution becomes important. The Norse sources were written down in medieval Iceland, mostly in the 13th century, after Scandinavia had already become Christian. The Poetic Edda preserves poems that may contain much older material, but we do not possess recordings of Viking Age storytellers. We have manuscripts copied by later hands. We have poetry full of symbolism, variation, and deliberate mystery. We also have Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, written as a guide to old myth and poetic language, but shaped by one learned medieval author. So dating individual ideas inside Ragnarok is difficult. Interpreting them is difficult too. Scholars debate how much reflects pre-Christian belief, how much was altered by centuries of retelling, and whether some images were influenced by Christian ideas about the end of the world. That does not make the myth less valuable. It simply means we should read it as myth. Ragnarok does not give a date. It does not describe a planet returning on a hidden orbit. It does not tell us that an object called Nibiru once passed overhead and reset northern civilization. The sun being swallowed is part of a mythic drama, not an astronomical observation recorded in code. And yet, after the fire and the flood, the story becomes strangely calm. The earth rises again from the sea, green and fertile. Fields grow without being planted. A new sun appears, carried by the daughter of the old sun. A few gods survive. Balder, the beautiful god whose death had helped set the tragedy in motion, returns from the realm of the dead. And human life survives too. A man and a woman, Leif and Lifthrasir, hide in a place called Hodmimir's Wood. They live on morning dew. When the world becomes habitable again, they emerge and repopulate it. That is the heart of Ragnarok. Not annihilation, but survival through annihilation. Modern reset stories often imagine catastrophe as a technical event. A rogue planet comes close. An impact strikes. Infrastructure fails. Civilization collapses. The question becomes, who has the bunker, the supplies, the secret warning? Ragnarok asks different questions. What happens when loyalty fails? What does courage mean when even the gods know they cannot win? Can life begin again after pride, violence, and disorder have burned themselves out? The world ends in the Norse imagination because ancient enemies finally break loose and because order cannot hold forever. But the world returns, not identical, not untouched, renewed, and that pattern, destruction, followed by a small surviving remnant and a green new beginning, would appear again and again in stories from many parts of the world. And perhaps the most widespread version of that pattern is not fire. It is water, a rising river, rain that does not stop, the sea moving inland, a familiar landscape disappearing beneath a flat, shining surface, a few people escaping in a boat on a mountain or in some sheltered high place. Then when the waters finally withdraw, the difficult beginning of the world all over again. Flood stories appear in so many places that people have long wondered whether they preserve the memory of one enormous shared disaster. Was there a single flood behind them all? A prehistoric tsunami? A sudden rise in sea level? A drowned coast? A lost civilization swallowed by the sea and remembered imperfectly by its scattered survivors? It is an appealing idea, but the evidence is more complicated. The oldest written flood traditions we have come from Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was a world built around water and threatened by it. The rivers gave life to fields, carried boats and goods, and made large cities possible. But they could also change course, overflow their banks, destroy mud brick houses, and turn farmland into a temporary inland sea. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods decide to send a flood that will destroy humanity. One god, Enki, secretly warns a righteous man named Atrahasis. He tells him to build a boat, bring living creatures aboard, and survive the coming waters. A similar story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There, the survivor is called Utnapishtim. He builds a great vessel, seals it with bitumen, takes aboard his household animals and skilled workers, and waits while a terrible storm covers the land. When the flood ends, he releases birds to search for dry ground. The details are famous because they resemble the later biblical story of Noah. In Genesis, God warns Noah, who builds an ark, saves his family and animals, and sends out birds after the waters begin to fall. These stories are connected in a broad cultural sense. Mesopotamian flood traditions are older in written form than Genesis, and the peoples of the ancient Near East lived in a world of trade, conquest, migration, exile, and storytelling across generations. Ideas travelled, stories changed names, purposes, and gods as they crossed from one community to another. But that does not mean every flood story on Earth came from Mesopotamia. Greek tradition had Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. In Indian tradition, Manu is warned by a fish that a great flood is coming and preserves life in a boat. Chinese traditions include stories of devastating floods and the long effort to control the waters, especially the tale of Yu the Great, whose labour helps make ordered society possible. Across the Americas, the Pacific, and many other regions, communities told stories about drowned lands, flood survivors, dangerous seas, and worlds remade after water. Some of these stories may have spread through contact. Some may have developed independently, and some may combine old memories with later religious and political concerns so thoroughly that separating the layers is almost impossible, because floods are not rare human experiences. For a farming village on a river plain, an extreme flood can erase a lifetime of work in a single night. Granaries collapse, fields vanish, livestock drown. Roads and boundaries disappear. The dead may never be recovered. When the water goes down, survivors face mud, hunger, disease, and the strange realization that their entire world has changed shape. For coastal peoples, the threat can come from another direction. Storm surges, tsunamis, collapsing shorelines, and slowly rising seas can take land not in one dramatic hour, but across many generations. A bay becomes deeper. A village site is abandoned. Familiar hunting grounds disappear beneath the tide. The memory of dry land can remain long after the land itself is gone. And after the last ice age, sea levels rose enormously as glaciers melted. Over thousands of years, coastlines around the world moved inland. Areas that had once been plains, marshes, and river valleys were flooded. The people who lived there would have seen the boundaries of land and sea change within the span of inherited memory. That does not prove that a particular myth records a particular event, but it helps explain why water became such a powerful language for loss. Flood myths are rarely only about water. In Atrahasis, humanity has become too noisy for the gods. The flood is in part a response to disorder. In Genesis, the flood becomes a moral judgment on a violent world. In Greek stories, divine anger and human arrogance are never far away. In Chinese traditions, controlling floodwater can become a sign that a ruler has the skill and virtue to bring order to the realm. So the flood can carry several meanings at once. It is ecological because it reflects real dependence on rivers, rain, and coasts. It is political because it asks who can restore order after disaster. And it is moral because it turns catastrophe into a warning about how people have lived. This is why attempts to find one literal flood behind all of them usually run into trouble. Archaeologists have found evidence of major ancient floods in parts of Mesopotamia. Some early cities contain thick layers of river-borne sediment, suggesting severe local inundations. But those layers do not all date to one moment, and they do not cover the whole region in the same way. They show that flooding happened. Nobody needed a planet-sized catastrophe to inspire terror beside the Euphrates. Other proposals have been more dramatic. The flooding of the Black Sea basin has been suggested as a possible source for some Near Eastern flood memories. Rapid sea level rise after the Ice Age has been linked to drowned coastal landscapes. Tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and sudden lake outbursts have all been considered as possible origins for particular traditions. Each hypothesis has something interesting to investigate. None provides direct proof that all flood myths descend from one shared disaster. Myths do not preserve the past like a sealed archive. They preserve it like a river carries silt. Something real may be there, but mixed with later storms, new channels, and the work of many hands. And this is where modern reset theories often enter the story. Once people notice that flood tales occur across the world, it can seem natural to imagine a single global event behind them. Then comes the next leap. Perhaps the event was caused by a comet, a rogue planet, or Nibiru passing near Earth. But ancient flood traditions do not mention Nibiru as the force that drowned the world. Mesopotamian stories describe divine decisions, storms, and overwhelming waters, not a hidden planet returning on a schedule. The connection is modern, created by combining separate myths with modern fears about cosmic impacts and planetary collapse. Flood stories endure not because they prove one forgotten reset, but because water has always had the power to reset a human world. A river can redraw a map, a storm can end a dynasty, a rising sea can turn home into legend, and sometimes as the ground dries and the survivors step out into a changed landscape, the question is not what destroyed the old world. It is how anyone managed to build the next one. The answer, archaeologists have learned, is usually not one thing. There is no single pattern called collapse, no universal switch that turns a civilization off. There are droughts that last for decades, earthquakes that destroy a city in minutes, volcanic eruptions that darken skies, bury fields, and poison water, epidemics that move along trade routes, wars that burn archives and scatter populations, and quieter disasters too, a river changing course, a harbour silting up, a trading partner disappearing, a generation of failed harvests slowly emptying a capital. For the people living through them, any one of these could feel like the end of the world. And in a sense it was. Not the end of Earth, not the destruction of every society everywhere, but the end of a familiar order, the end of a city's power, a king's authority, a trade network, a way of life that had seemed permanent. Take the late Bronze Age collapse, beginning around 1200 BC. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been connected by an extraordinary web of kingdoms. Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, cities in Cyprus, the Levant and Mesopotamia, all exchanged copper, tin, grain, timber, textiles, luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, and royal marriages. A palace in Greece could depend on metal from far away. A ruler in Egypt could receive messages written in Babylonian cuneiform. Ships crossed the sea carrying goods between places whose languages and gods were very different, but whose economies had become deeply connected. Then, over a relatively short period, that world changed. Mycenaean palaces were destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite capital of Hattusa fell silent. Many cities along the Levantine coast were damaged, deserted, or rebuilt on a smaller scale. Trade routes weakened. Writing disappeared from some regions for centuries. Populations moved. Political systems that had lasted generations broke apart. For a long time, people wanted one dramatic cause. Perhaps invaders known as the Sea Peoples swept across the region. Perhaps earthquakes destroyed the cities. Perhaps drought caused famine. Famine caused migration, and migration caused war. Perhaps rebellions, piracy, disease, or the failure of trade pushed already fragile kingdoms past the point of recovery. The most likely answer is not one cause, but a dangerous combination. Complex societies can be strong. They can store grain, build armies, manage irrigation, and connect distant regions. But complexity can also create dependence. When several systems fail at once, a drought is no longer just a drought. It becomes hunger, political unrest, migration, conflict, and the breakdown of exchange. The Late Bronze Age collapse was real, but it was not a confirmed global reset. Egypt survived, though weakened. Assyria survived and later expanded. Many smaller communities endured. New societies emerged from the ruins. The old palace world ended, but people did not vanish. They adapted. That pattern appears again and again. A city falls and survivors move to the hills. A kingdom loses its capital, and power shifts to smaller towns. Farmers change crops. Merchants find new routes. Languages, religious practices, and craft traditions continue even when the rulers who once sponsored them are gone. Sometimes the evidence of disaster is startlingly physical. At the site of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, now called Santorini, archaeologists found a Bronze Age town, preserved beneath volcanic ash. Multi-story buildings, painted walls, storage jars, streets, workshops. Then, sometime in the 2nd millennium BC, the volcano erupted with immense force. The eruption reshaped the island. Ash fell across parts of the Aegean. Tsunamis may have struck nearby coasts. The event would have been terrifying for communities dependent on the sea. Because Thera erupted near the height of Minoan civilization on Crete, people have often connected it to the legend of Atlantis. Others have wondered whether it helped weaken Minoan power. It may have had serious regional effects, but caution matters. The eruption did not simply erase the Minoans overnight. The dating is complex. Crete was not destroyed in one clean volcanic moment. Political change in the Aegean involved many pressures over time, including rivalry, warfare, and the later rise of Mycenaean powers. A dramatic event can become a legend, but similarity is not proof. A sunken island, a volcanic explosion, and a story told centuries later do not automatically belong to the same historical chain. The same caution applies to earthquakes. Ancient cities often sit near fault lines because people needed water, fertile land, coastlines and trade routes, exactly the places where geological risks could also be high. Destruction layers may reveal fallen walls, crushed buildings, fires, and hurried abandonment. But even then, archaeologists must ask careful questions. Was it an earthquake, an attack, a rebuilding project? Several disasters separated by years. The ground preserves clues, not neat answers. And pandemics, though harder to see in the archaeological record, could transform societies just as deeply. Ancient DNA has identified pathogens in some old human remains, including strains of plague. Disease travelled where humans travelled along roads, rivers, ships, armies and trade routes. A sickness did not need to kill everyone to alter inheritance, labour, military strength, and trust in rulers or gods. These are real catastrophes. They are enough. They show that human history has been repeatedly shaped by crisis, but usually in uneven ways. One region suffers drought while another receives rain. One port is ruined while another becomes more important. One kingdom collapses while its neighbour absorbs migrants, knowledge and trade. That is very different from evidence for a returning planet causing synchronized global resets. Archaeology gives us many local and regional disasters. It gives us ruined cities, ash layers, famine, abandoned fields, broken trade routes and graves from violent times. What it does not give us is a clear repeating pattern of worldwide civilization ending destruction at intervals linked to Nibiru. The past was dangerous enough without adding a hidden planet. And yet the ruins tell a quieter, more hopeful story too. Again and again, people survived the broken world. They carried seeds, tools, stories and skills into new places. They rebuilt walls. They reopened routes. They made new rituals for old losses. Collapse was never only an ending. It was also painfully and imperfectly a beginning. And if disasters on Earth could transform whole regions, then it is understandable that people looked upward and wondered about disasters from the sky. The sky can be dangerous. Not usually, not often on the scale imagined in apocalypse stories. But Earth does move through a solar system full of rocks, dust, ice and debris. Most of it never comes close. Most of it burns harmlessly in the atmosphere as a brief line of light. But occasionally something larger arrives, and when it does, the results can be extraordinary. The best-known example happened around 66 million years ago, long before humans, cities, temples or written memory. A large asteroid, perhaps 10 kilometers across, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It left behind the Chicxulub crater, a vast scar buried beneath younger rock and sediment. For decades, scientists assembled the evidence. A thin layer of clay found around the world contained unusually high levels of iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in some asteroids. Beneath the Gulf of Mexico, geologists identified the immense circular structure of the crater itself. Shocked minerals showed that the rock had experienced pressures possible only in an enormous impact. The Chicxulub event is now strongly connected to the mass extinction that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. It did not destroy all life. Life is harder to erase than people sometimes think. Birds survived, mammals survived, plants, insects, fish, crocodilians, and countless smaller organisms survived in altered ecosystems. But the impact changed the conditions of the planet so violently that many species could not adapt quickly enough. Dust and soot may have darkened the sky. Fires spread across some landscapes. Ocean chemistry changed. Food chains began to fail. It was not a reset in the sense of a clean beginning. It was a catastrophe followed by a long, uneven recovery. And it happened 66 million years ago. That detail matters. Chicxulub is real evidence for cosmic hazard. But it is evidence from deep time, not evidence that Earth experiences civilization ending impacts on a fixed human calendar. The existence of one immense ancient impact does not prove a hidden object returns every few thousand years to destroy the world. Still, astronomers do take the danger seriously. Near-Earth objects, usually shortened to NEOs, are asteroids and comets whose paths bring them relatively close to our planet's orbit. Observatories repeatedly scan the sky, tracking known objects and looking for new ones. Their size, brightness, orbit, and future position are calculated as carefully as possible. Most discovered objects pose no threat. Some pass closer than the Moon and continue quietly onward. A few are watched because their paths contain small uncertainties. With more observations, those uncertainties usually shrink. This is not panic. It is practical science. A small impactor can still be dangerous. In 2013, a rocky object, roughly 20 meters wide, entered Earth's atmosphere over Chelyabinsk, Russia. It exploded high in the air. The blast wave shattered windows across the city and injured more than 1,000 people, mostly from flying glass. No secret planet was involved. No ancient prophecy had been fulfilled. It was a natural object, difficult to spot, because it approached from the direction of the sun. That is what a real hazard often looks like. Not a world-ending visitor announced years in advance. Something smaller, sudden, measurable, and intensely local. Comets were different in the ancient imagination. Unlike ordinary stars, they appeared without warning. A pale glowing head emerged in the darkness, followed by a tail that could stretch across a large part of the sky. Night after night, it changed position. Then, eventually, it vanished. For societies that saw the heavens as ordered and meaningful, a comet was almost impossible to ignore. The sun rose where it should. The moon followed its familiar phases. Planets wandered, but they wandered in patterns that skilled observers could learn. A comet seemed less orderly. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the sky, a visitor from beyond the known structure of the world. So comets became omens. Chinese court astronomers recorded them with remarkable care, noting their colour, direction and length. In Mesopotamia, unusual celestial appearances could be interpreted as messages about kings, warfare, harvests, or the fate of cities. In medieval Europe, Halley's Comet was famously associated with the year 1066 appearing in the sky before the Norman conquest of England. Later storytellers gave the comet a dramatic role in that political crisis. But the comet did not cause the invasion. It did not choose a king. It did not carry history in its tail. People connected the two because human beings are pattern-making creatures. When something strange appears overhead during a season of fear, uncertainty, war, or change, it can seem impossible that the events are unrelated. That feeling is understandable. It is also where hazard can become myth. An observed comet is a visible object with a track through the sky. Its orbit can be measured. Some, like Halley's Comet, return on long but predictable paths. A documented impact is different. It leaves physical evidence, a crater, melted rock, shocked minerals, layers of ejecta, chemical signatures, sometimes eyewitness accounts in the case of modern events. A hidden planet claim is something else entirely. A planet large enough to repeatedly pass through the inner solar system, close enough to disrupt Earth, would not remain hidden. Its gravity would affect the paths of known planets, moons, asteroids, and spacecraft. It would be visible to telescopes long before any supposed arrival. It would leave a trail of evidence across astronomy. Nibiru stories borrow emotional force from things that are real. Impacts are real. Comets are real. Extinctions are real. The sky has occasionally delivered disaster, and ancient people really did watch it with awe and fear. But reality does not automatically support every story built around it. The difference is not whether the universe can be dangerous. It can. The difference is whether there is evidence. And when we look for evidence of a returning hidden world, the ancient tablets, archaeological ruins, and modern sky surveys do not point to one. They point instead to something more familiar, human beings trying to give shape to uncertainty beneath a vast and sometimes unsettling sky. And yet for many people, the ancient tablets did seem to point to one. Not because the tablets themselves clearly described a hidden planet approaching Earth. They do not, but because in the 1970s a writer named Zecharia Sitchin offered a new way to read them, a way that connected Mesopotamian gods, human origins, astronomy, lost knowledge, and the possibility of a returning world. It was a powerful story. Sitchin was not trained as an Assyriologist, the specialist term for scholars who study the languages and cultures of ancient Mesopotamia. But he spent years reading translations of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, comparing words, myths, and images. In 1976, he published The 12th Planet, the first major book in what became known as the Earth Chronicles series. His central claim was extraordinary. According to Sitchin, Nibiru was not simply a title or a point in the sky. It was an actual planet inhabited by beings called the Anunnaki. This planet, he proposed, travelled on a vast elongated orbit around the Sun, returning to the inner solar system roughly once every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki, in his interpretation, were not gods in the symbolic or religious sense. They were visitors from another world. Sitchin argued that they came to Earth in the distant past, seeking resources, especially gold. He connected their arrival to ancient Mesopotamian stories about divine beings, creating human beings. But where traditional readings saw mythic accounts of gods shaping humanity from clay, blood, and divine intention, Sitchin saw something much more literal. He proposed that the Anunnaki genetically engineered humans, perhaps from earlier hominins, to work for them. In this version of the story, the first cities, the sudden appearance of kingship, and the ancient fascination with the stars were not simply products of human cultural development. They were traces of contact with an advanced extraterrestrial civilization. Temples became possible landing sites, gods became astronauts. Myths became coded historical records, and Nibiru became the home world waiting beyond the darkness, destined one day to return. You can see why this idea spread. It took fragments from the oldest written civilization we know, added the real mystery of ancient languages, mixed in space travel and human origins, and created one enormous hidden narrative. Every strange word could become a clue. Every damaged tablet could conceal another secret. Every gap in the archaeological record could feel like evidence of something deliberately forgotten. But this is where the story meets a serious problem. Specialists in Sumerian and Akkadian, the ancient languages behind many of these tablets, have generally rejected Sitchin's translations and conclusions. Not because scholars dislike strange ideas or because ancient history is completely settled. Ancient history is full of uncertainty. Tablets are broken. Words can have several meanings. Texts were copied and changed over centuries. But uncertainty is not a blank check. The objections are specific. Sitchin often assigned meanings to words that do not match their known use in surviving texts. He combined material from different periods and traditions as though it described one continuous historical account. And he treated mythological language as technical description without the linguistic evidence needed to support that leap. The Anunnaki, for example, were a group of deities in Mesopotamian religion. Their role changed across time and texts, as religious ideas often do. They were not described in the cuneiform record as astronauts from a planet on a 3,600-year orbit, and Nibiru itself was not consistently the name of a hidden world. In different contexts, it could refer to a crossing point, a celestial station, or an associated heavenly body. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, it is connected with Marduk, the god who establishes order in the cosmos. That is complicated, symbolic religious language. It is not an orbital diagram. Still, Sitchin's work found a large audience, partly because ancient Mesopotamia can feel inaccessible. The writing is wedge-shaped. The languages are long dead. The tablets sit in museums, often incomplete, translated through years of patient scholarly work. Most people cannot open a Sumerian dictionary and check a claim for themselves. When a subject is difficult to access, confident alternative explanations can become very attractive, especially when they promise that experts have missed something obvious, or worse, that experts have found the truth and hidden it. But there is an important distinction here. A story can be culturally influential without being historically supported. Sitchin's books had enormous influence on modern ideas about ancient astronauts, the Anunnaki, secret human origins, and Nibiru as a returning planet. Later writers, documentary programs, online forums, and prophecy communities borrowed his themes again and again. That influence is real. The evidence for his claims is not, and as the Nibiru idea moved from paperback speculation into the growing world of internet prophecy, the returning planet stopped being a distant ancient mystery. It became something more immediate, something people were told to fear. By the late 1990s, the internet was beginning to turn that fear into a shared project. Not yet the polished social media world of algorithms, influencers, and endless video feeds. This was the older internet. Message boards, email lists. Personal websites made in bright colours and strange fonts. Usenet groups where thousands of people could argue for weeks about a single photograph of the sky. It was an environment perfectly designed for Planet X. You could find fragments of Sitchin's ideas beside reports of UFO sightings, biblical prophecy, government secrecy, geomagnetic reversals, solar flares, and ancient flood myths. A person might arrive looking for information about Mesopotamian astronomy and leave convinced that NASA was tracking a hidden planet on a collision course with Earth. The connections did not have to be historically accurate. They only had to feel connected. Ancient people watched the sky. Modern astronomers watched the sky. Ancient myths described destruction. Modern science described asteroids and comets. Governments kept some information classified. Therefore, perhaps the old myths were warnings. The scientists knew more than they admitted, and the hidden planet was already on its way. This is how a flexible story grows, not through one piece of decisive evidence, but through hundreds of smaller suspicions that seem to point in the same direction. One of the most influential figures in this new phase was Nancy Lieder. In the mid-1990s, Lieder began describing messages she said she had received from extraterrestrial beings known as the Zetas. According to her account, these beings had communicated with her through an implanted device. They warned her about a massive object moving through the solar system, an object often called Planet X. The warning was not vague. Lieder predicted that Planet X would pass close to Earth in 2003, causing a catastrophic shift of the planet's crust or poles. In some versions of the claim, the consequences would be civilization ending. Oceans would move, cities would flood, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions would spread across the globe. The familiar geography of the world would be remade in a matter of hours or days. It was the ancient reset story translated into the language of late 20th century disaster. Not gods sending a flood because kings had become arrogant. Not Ragnarok. Not the end of an age in the Maya calendar. Not a cosmic battle between order and chaos. This was a planet, a physical object, something supposedly visible to telescopes, hidden by authorities, and heading toward the place where you were sitting right now. And 2003 gave the fear a deadline. Deadlines are powerful. A prophecy without a date can drift forever in the imagination. But give it a year, a month, perhaps even a particular week, and the future begins to feel like a locked door, slowly swinging open. People searched the skies. They studied satellite images. They traded rumours about unusual weather, strange animal behaviour, military preparations, and temporary disruptions in government services. Normal events became possible clues. A bright object near the Sun might be Planet X. It could also be a camera artifact, a known planet, a comet, or simply an image processed badly. An earthquake somewhere on Earth might be the first tremor of the coming pole shift. It could also be an earthquake, because Earth has always been restless. A heat wave, a storm, a power outage, an unusual sunset, all of it could be gathered into the growing archive of warning signs. This did not mean everyone in these communities believed exactly the same thing. Far from it. Some expected a literal collision. Some expected a near pass. Some imagined a magnetic reversal. Others believed the catastrophe would be spiritual rather than physical, a cleansing of corrupt institutions, an awakening, a separation between those who were prepared and those who were not. Planet X was becoming less like a specific astronomical claim and more like a container. You could pour almost any fear into it. Fear of environmental collapse, fear of war, fear of government deception, fear that modern life had become fragile beyond repair, fear that the old world was morally exhausted and had to be swept away before something better could begin. Then 2003 arrived, and Earth did not collide with a hidden planet. No giant object crossed the inner solar system. No global crustal shift overturned continents. No predicted catastrophe took place. For an ordinary scientific prediction, that would be the end of the matter. A claim makes a testable forecast. The forecast fails. The claim is discarded or substantially changed, but prophecy communities do not always work that way. When the date passed, explanations appeared. The event had been delayed. The Zetas had intervened. Humanity had changed its collective course. The warning had been misunderstood. The object was still there, but its path had altered. The catastrophe had happened on some level that ordinary people could not perceive. And soon, new dates began to circulate. Some predictions attached themselves to 2012, borrowing the misunderstood idea that the Maya calendar ended in an ancient forecast of global destruction. Others moved further into the future, linked to eclipses, planetary alignments, solar activity, or newly discovered astronomical objects. Every new date offered another chance for the story to become urgent again. This pattern is important. A failed prediction did not necessarily destroy the larger belief. Sometimes it strengthened the community around it. Believers could interpret survival as proof that hidden forces had acted. Skeptics became people who had failed to see the warning. And the fact that the predicted disaster had not occurred could be folded back into the story as another mystery. Why had it been postponed? Who had changed the plan? What else were the authorities hiding? The early internet helped these ideas survive because it made constant revision easy. A printed prophecy book had to remain fixed on the shelf. A website could be updated overnight. A message board could produce dozens of new explanations before morning. Old claims could disappear into broken links, while new versions spread faster than anyone could check their sources. And in the process, Nibiru changed again. The ancient Mesopotamian term had already been transformed by Sitchin into the name of a distant inhabited planet. Now it became attached to almost any mysterious object in the sky. Planet X Nemesis Wormwood, a brown dwarf, a rogue planet, a hidden companion to the Sun. Sometimes it was said to be red, sometimes blue, sometimes invisible, sometimes larger than Earth, sometimes larger than Jupiter, sometimes so strange that ordinary physics supposedly could not detect it. The details shifted constantly. The fear remained. And behind all of it was a very old human instinct. To look upward when the world feels unstable. To wonder whether the sky contains a message about what is coming next. to search ancient stories for evidence that people before us knew the pattern, survived it once, and left warnings for those who would live through its return. But a story about a hidden planet raises a question that does not belong to mythology or prophecy. It belongs to astronomy. Could a massive world really be moving toward Earth unnoticed? Astronomy cannot promise that every object in the universe has already been found. The solar system is large, really large. Beyond Neptune lies a cold, dark region filled with icy bodies, dwarf planets, comets, and objects so faint that even powerful telescopes can struggle to see them. Astronomers are still finding new worlds out there. Pluto itself was only discovered in 1930. Eris, another dwarf planet, was found in 2005. Smaller bodies continue to appear in survey data every year. So the honest answer is not that there are no unknown objects anywhere beyond the familiar planets. There could be, but that is very different from saying a large hidden planet could be approaching Earth, about to pass through the inner solar system, and somehow remain invisible to every major observatory, amateur astronomer, spacecraft tracker, and planetary scientist on Earth. A massive object does not travel silently through a crowded solar system. Gravity gives it away. Every planet pulls on every other planet. Usually the effects are small because the distances are enormous. But astronomers can measure these small effects with extraordinary precision. They calculate where Mars should be, where Jupiter should be, how quickly Saturn should move, when an asteroid will pass Earth, and where a spacecraft must point its engines to arrive at a distant destination. These calculations are not guesses. They are constantly tested against observation. If a hidden planet of substantial mass were moving inward from the outer solar system, its gravity would begin disturbing the known planets. It might slightly alter the orbit of Mars. It could create unexpected changes in Jupiter's path. It could pull on comets and asteroids in ways that did not fit existing models. Spacecraft travelling through the solar system would arrive a little early, a little late, or need unexplained course corrections. Over time, those discrepancies would build. This is not just theory. Neptune was discovered because astronomers noticed that Uranus was not moving exactly as expected. Something unseen appeared to be tugging at it. By studying that tug, they predicted where another planet should be. Telescopes were pointed toward that region of the sky, and there Neptune was. An unknown world can be hidden for a while. Its gravity is harder to hide. And a world close enough to threaten Earth would not be subtle. A planet large enough to cause global pole shifts, continent-scale floods, or sudden destruction would have to come extraordinarily close, or possess immense mass. Either possibility would leave obvious evidence well before the final encounter. Its gravitational influence would be measurable. Its movement against the stars would be trackable. Its brightness, depending on its size, surface, and distance, might be visible even with modest equipment. The same applies to a supposed brown dwarf, an object larger than a planet but smaller than a star. Brown dwarfs can be dim in visible light, especially when cold, but they still emit heat. They can often be detected in infrared light, the part of the spectrum associated with warmth rather than ordinary colour. This is why infrared surveys matter. Over the past several decades, astronomers have mapped the sky in visible light, infrared light, radio waves, ultraviolet light, X-rays, and other wavelengths. Missions such as IRAS, WISE and NEO-WISE have surveyed huge portions of the sky, helping identify asteroids, comets, distant galaxies, brown dwarfs, and faint objects in the outer solar system. Ground-based observatories have done the same, again and again, from different locations, using different instruments. None of this makes astronomy perfect. A small, dark, distant object can be difficult to find. A faint comet may be discovered only after it has entered the inner solar system. There are gaps in surveys, limits to telescope sensitivity, and always more sky to examine. But secrecy is not a plausible explanation for an approaching giant planet. There is no single telescope that controls the sky. There are national observatories, university observatories, private observatories, spacecraft automated survey programs, and countless amateur astronomers. People in different countries, speaking different languages, using different equipment, compare their observations openly. Astronomical data is not held together by one locked door. If an enormous object were coming toward Earth, it would not require an official announcement to become known. It would be visible in the numbers, visible in images, visible in the changing motions of planets and asteroids. It would be noticed by people whose entire profession, and often whose lifelong hobby, is measuring precisely such things. This is where another idea can create confusion. Sometimes people hear astronomers discuss Planet 9 and assume this must be Nibiru under a more respectable name. It is not. Planet 9 is a hypothesis, not a confirmed planet. Some astronomers have noticed that a handful of very distant objects beyond Neptune appear to have unusual orbital patterns. One possible explanation is that an undiscovered planet, perhaps several times Earth's mass, is orbiting far beyond Neptune. Other explanations remain possible. The observed clustering may partly reflect the way objects are discovered, or it may be produced by other gravitational processes in the distant solar system. The question is still open, but even if Planet 9 exists, it would not resemble the popular Nibiru story. It would be extremely far away, moving on an orbit that could take thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of years to complete. It would not be a hidden visitor sweeping suddenly past Earth every few thousand years. It would not be approaching on a secret collision path. It would be a distant member of the solar system, important for understanding its outer architecture, but not an imminent threat. Then there are the warning signs often gathered around Nibiru claims. Strange weather, for example. Weather can be strange because Earth's climate system is complicated. Oceans, atmosphere, ice, land, volcanic eruptions, human-caused warming, and natural climate patterns all interact. Storms, droughts, floods, heat waves, and unusual seasons can be serious, destructive, and sometimes terrifying. But they are not evidence that an invisible planet is near. A claim like that needs a physical mechanism, measurements and predictions that can be tested. The same is true of pole shifts. Earth's magnetic poles do move. They have wandered throughout geological history, and the magnetic field has reversed many times over millions of years. But this is not the same thing as Earth physically tipping over, with the crust sliding across the planet in a sudden global catastrophe. Geological evidence does not support the popular image of continents rapidly shifting because a passing planet has pulled Earth out of place. And planetary alignments, despite their dramatic appearance in prophecy, do not produce mysterious concentrated forces. The planets are always exerting gravity on Earth. During an alignment, their pulls do not suddenly combine into something capable of breaking the planet apart. Jupiter has enormous mass, but it is also very far away. Even its gravitational influence on Earth is tiny compared with the pull of the Moon, which affects ocean tides every day without triggering a planetary reset. So astronomy can say something quite clear. It can say that the solar system contains unknowns. There may be distant planets still waiting to be found. There are comets not yet discovered. There are objects beyond Neptune that remain faint, cold, and poorly understood. That uncertainty is real. But uncertainty is not evidence for every possible fear. And when it comes to Nibiru as an imminent returning planet, a hidden world approaching Earth to cause destruction, no credible astronomical evidence supports the claim. No unexplained disturbance in planetary orbits, no confirmed infrared detection, no giant object moving through the inner solar system, no approaching encounter waiting just beyond the edge of official knowledge. The ancient stories remain powerful because they speak about real human concerns: disorder, flood, famine, the fear that a stable world can suddenly become unfamiliar. But the sky, as far as modern astronomy can tell, is not preparing to send Nibiru back. If the sky is not preparing to send Nibiru back, then why does the story keep returning? Why does each generation seem to discover or rediscover some ancient warning that supposedly explains the disasters gathering around them? Part of the answer is that uncertainty is uncomfortable. Human beings are remarkably good at living with danger when we can name it, measure it, and imagine a response. A storm is frightening, but a storm has a forecast. A disease outbreak is frightening, but doctors can study it. Economic trouble, political conflict, changing technology, environmental disruption, all of these can feel overwhelming because they involve so many causes at once. No single person can see the whole system, and when the world becomes difficult to understand, a hidden pattern can feel strangely comforting. A reset story says that the chaos is not really chaos. It says there is one great cycle behind everything. One returning planet, one ancient timetable, one secret known long ago by priests, kings, scribes, or astronomers who watched the sky from temple roofs. That explanation may be frightening, but it is also simple. Instead of facing hundreds of interacting problems, climate, war, inequality, new technologies, disease, resource pressure, political instability, the story gathers them into one dramatic cause. The world is not complicated. The world is approaching a scheduled ending. There is a peculiar relief in that idea. If disaster has one hidden source, then perhaps it can be understood. Perhaps the people who know the secret are not helpless. Perhaps old texts contain the instructions everyone else has missed. This is where ancient civilizations gain a special kind of authority. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Maya, Greece, India, the Norse world, all of them lived so long ago that their surviving words can seem almost supernatural. A damaged tablet, a difficult inscription, a calendar with unfamiliar numbers, and suddenly there is room for imagination to rush in. The distance itself becomes persuasive. If modern experts disagree, perhaps the ancients knew better. If a text is hard to translate, perhaps it contains a code. If a myth describes a flood, a darkened sun, fire from heaven, or the end of an age, perhaps it is not a story at all. Perhaps it is a warning passed down from survivors of a forgotten catastrophe. Sometimes ancient texts do preserve memories of real conditions. Floods happened, droughts happened, cities fell, eclipses frightened people, comets appeared without warning, volcanic eruptions darkened skies far from their source. The natural world could be generous for years, then suddenly merciless. But a real experience of disaster is not the same as a precise prediction of the future. Ancient people observed cycles because cycles mattered. The moon returned, the seasons returned, rivers rose and fell. Planets wandered through familiar regions of the sky. Kings wanted to know what would happen next. Farmers needed to know when to plant, and priests sought signs that order still held against disorder. They did not all share one prophecy of Nibiru. The Babylonian use of the word Nibiru belonged to a particular Mesopotamian world of stars, gods, crossings, and royal omens. Maya calendars were not countdown clocks to a final destruction. Egyptian renewal centered on the daily and yearly restoration of cosmic order. Greek thinkers imagined ages and cycles in several different ways. Indian traditions described immense stretches of time, while Zoroastrian ideas of renewal followed their own religious logic. Norse stories of destruction and rebirth emerged from another world entirely. These traditions can resemble one another, Because people everywhere watched the same sky and lived with the same basic facts of human vulnerability. Winter comes, floodwaters rise, empires disappear. The old order can break, then somehow life continues. In the modern world, these ancient fragments move faster than ever. A dramatic image of a dark planet beside Earth, a mysterious line from a tablet, a clip of a strange storm, a computer-generated map of an incoming orbit. All can travel across the world in minutes. Algorithmic media tends to reward what is shocking, emotional, and easy to share. A careful explanation of Babylonian astronomy rarely spreads as quickly as a headline saying, "Ancient prophecy finally decoded." The more frightening the claim, the more attention it receives. And attention can begin to feel like evidence. But the historical picture is quieter, and in its own way more interesting. Ancient cultures did not leave behind a single coordinated warning about a hidden world returning to reset civilization. They left many different attempts to understand time, danger, nature, and the fragile order of human life. Perhaps that is why the reset story survives, not because it predicts the future, but because it speaks to a recurring fear. The fear that the world we know is temporary, and the hope, just beneath it, that after disorder something may begin again. And maybe that is the quiet truth beneath all these stories. The ancient sky was never empty. It was full of movement. The moon changing shape night after night. Venus appearing before dawn, then disappearing into the sun's glare, then returning in the evening. Mars glowing red and strange against the fixed stars. Eclipses turning familiar daylight into something briefly unrecognizable. Comets arriving without invitation, trailing light across a sky that usually followed rules. For ancient people, these were not just beautiful sights. They were part of the structure of reality. The sky kept time. It marked planting seasons, religious festivals, voyages, taxes, royal ceremonies, and the long succession of years. It gave priests, scribes, farmers, sailors, and kings a way to place human life inside a larger pattern, a pattern that seemed stable even when everything on Earth was not. And that brings us back to Nibiru. In ancient Mesopotamia, Nibiru was not a hidden planet racing through deep space toward Earth. It was a word with meanings connected to crossing, transition, and celestial position. In some texts, it could refer to a particular heavenly body, often associated with Jupiter or with Marduk in a mythological setting. Its meaning depended on context. Like many ancient words, it lived inside a world of ritual, astronomy, politics, and religion that does not fit neatly into modern categories. The modern Nibiru story is something else. It is a recent narrative assembled from misunderstood translations, speculative books, internet rumours, dramatic imagery, and a very modern appetite for secret knowledge. It takes a fragment from ancient Mesopotamia and places it inside a story about a massive unseen planet, a returning orbit, and a scheduled global catastrophe. But there is no reliable evidence that Babylonian astronomers described such a world. No ancient tablet has been shown to contain a countdown to an incoming planet. No accepted astronomical observation reveals a giant object approaching Earth from the darkness beyond the known planets. That does not make the ancient material less fascinating. In some ways, it makes it more fascinating, because the real story is not about one forgotten prophecy that solves everything. It is about thousands of years of human beings trying to make sense of a universe that could be orderly, frightening, generous, and unpredictable all at once. The Babylonians recorded planetary motions with astonishing patience. Maya scribes created calendars capable of tracking time across immense spans. Egyptian priests watched the return of the Nile and the rising of stars, seeing renewal in the regular restoration of order. Greek poets and philosophers imagined ages of humanity, floods, decline and return. Indian traditions described cycles so vast that a single human lifetime became almost impossibly small. Norse storytellers remembered a world that could break beneath fire, ice, and conflict, then begin again. These traditions were not all saying the same thing. They did not agree on one date. They did not point toward one astronomical mechanism. They did not describe one universal reset button hidden in the sky. But they did share something deeper. They shared the experience of living in a world where certainty was limited. A farmer could prepare the fields and still lose everything to drought. A king could build walls and still watch an enemy army appear beyond the horizon. A city could flourish for centuries, then decline through war, disease, shifting trade routes, environmental stress, or political failure. A flood could come, a volcano could erupt, a comet could appear when no comet had been expected. When people could not control these forces, they looked for patterns. Calendars offered patterns. Omens offered patterns. Myths offered patterns. Cosmic cycles offered patterns. Even flood stories, which may preserve memories of real local disasters in some cases, offered a way to imagine survival after overwhelming loss. The point was not always prediction in the modern scientific sense. It was meaning. If the heavens had a pattern, perhaps life had a pattern too. If destruction came, perhaps it was not random. If the old order ended, perhaps renewal was still possible. That is why these stories continue to speak to us. Not because they prove that a global reset has been scheduled in advance, but because they give shape to a feeling that every generation eventually knows. The feeling that the world is changing faster than we can understand it. Modern anxieties are different from ancient anxieties in many ways. We have satellites, telescopes, climate models, global communication networks, and scientific methods that ancient sky watchers could never have imagined. We can track asteroids, predict eclipses to the second, observe planets around distant stars, and detect objects moving through the outer solar system. And yet, emotionally, the old questions remain. Are we safe? What happens when the familiar order fails? Is there something in the sky we have missed? Will the next disaster be the one from which we do not recover? These are human questions. They do not belong only to Babylon, Egypt, the Maya world, Greece, India, Persia, or the northern storytellers who imagined Ragnarok. They belong to anyone who has stood outside at night and felt how large the universe really is. But the scale of the universe does not have to make us afraid. The night sky can remind us of danger, certainly. Earth has been struck by impacts before. The climate has changed before. Civilizations have risen, suffered, adapted, and disappeared. Nature does not promise stability forever, but the sky also reminds us of something else. Most of what we see above us follows understandable patterns. The planets move in paths that can be calculated. The stars rise and set with patient regularity. The moon returns, the seasons turn, and when real hazards exist, understanding them is more useful than turning them into prophecy. The ancient people who watched the heavens were not foolish for searching for meaning. They were doing what humans have always done. They were paying attention. They were recording what returned. They were telling stories large enough to hold fear, loss, hope, and the possibility that life might continue after disaster. We can honour that impulse without pretending that every myth is a literal forecast. We can read Nibiru as part of Mesopotamian history, not as a threat waiting beyond the planets. We can appreciate ancient calendars without turning them into doomsday clocks. We can listen to flood myths, renewal stories, and cosmic cycles as records of human imagination, memory, and endurance. And then, perhaps, we can return to Earth, to the ordinary world beneath the stars, to the small, real things that remain within reach. A quiet room, a familiar voice, rain against a window, the slow passage of night, the knowledge that tomorrow, whatever it brings, will arrive 1 hour at a time. So, if you look up at the sky tonight, you do not need to search for a hidden world coming to end everything. You can simply look at the moon, at Jupiter perhaps, shining steadily where ancient observers once saw signs of gods and kings, at the distant stars, whose light has crossed unimaginable distances just to reach your eyes. And you can let the sky be mysterious without letting it become frightening. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient skies and modern fears, please like, comment and subscribe. And let us know where you are listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description.